Ladies and gentlemen, it's another episode of the Big Boys Table. We're coming at you with episode 59, The Third Dimension. And joining me, as always, is the three-man himself, Mesk, who is here to tell us for why we are 10 episodes out from episode 69. Do you think we'll be able to record 10 more episodes after this, Mesk? What's your read on the situation?
I don't know. Everything's a fucking disaster. Yeah. It's been a fucking roller coaster, man.
Yeah.
So without going into too much details, when did we last record? I think we last recorded. I decided to make a small little video to go with that, and I think that was about a month and a half ago.
Yeah. It was when we'll cover a little bit of your ARPG-styled game in Unreal in this actual episode, a bit more of a progress update or whatever towards the end of it. But yeah, it's definitely been a little bit, which is, I mean, it's kind of good because since we're going to cover it anyway, it means that there's been a lot of developments. It's just that there's also been a lot of real-life insanity that has been going on for you. So I'm sure scheduling and all this other stuff is going to be perhaps even more challenging. But hey, if we always just do early morning episodes like what we're recording today, which is like 7 a.m. your time, then maybe it'll work out. You never know.
Yeah, well, it's been fucking. I talked a bit about this before, that trying to wrangle this insanity in real life has just been insane. And in October was just like the most insane shit I've had to deal with since the last cat died. And we could be getting our eviction notice today on top of it. People have been going in and out of the hospital. I've had to navigate around COVID patients because here in Canada, our hospitals will just discharge you without even testing you. You know, that draconian country. It's all about martial law, cop cars hunting down people on the road in Toronto to question them if they see them out. And then we don't even discharge people who are past 80 years old and test them. But we don't even care. It's like, oh, you're in a high risk for this virus that supposedly is killing people. Guess we won't bother to test you. So that's just like just a tiny filament of the raw, unending insanity. Trying to work amidst all that, Jesus Christ, man, it's just been fucking unending.
Unending sounds like the perfect word to describe that. However, despite that, you have actually been able to make progress. Like I said, we'll cover a decent amount of that towards the tail end of this episode. So if people are specifically interested in that, there's timestamps and YouTube shit below. You guys know how to use YouTube. You've used this platform before. Oh, wait, they changed all the UI for no reason. Oh, they're just trying to justify their fucking jobs. Oh, my God. Well, not only did they change the UI, this is actually a perfect segue that I definitely didn't plan, because the change of the UI on YouTube obviously is like it's not like they changed everything.
I actually haven't seen it.
Oh, okay.
Because I think my browsers they're using user agents that are really old, so it doesn't load it. Or I'm using add-ons in some of the browsers that just kick it off to like one of the third-party sites that doesn't load any of the garbage they've got. So the main thing to note is that they have rounded corners. They've graduated to Apple level. But it's not really that massive of a change. It's just like they're just changing shit because they have to justify their positions in the company, really,
which happens all the time in these companies. But what really got me was that they changed some of the studio stuff for like people, like when you're uploading videos or whatever. Some of that has been changed, but most of it hasn't. It's like icons have been changed, but the general layout hasn't. And this got me thinking, like, when I was trying to come up with a way to segue into our first topic, that was a perfect one, because we're going to be talking about art direction, or lack thereof, in games in general. And it feels like the YouTube thing is just a funny little indication that, hey, this happens all the time.
Corporate
where people
arts.
Just, like, they change shit in the middle of nowhere with no quality control, and also like they don't do it holistically. They just like, oh, let me just like slap these icons be different for no reason, but actually they're only different on this page and not that page. So that's a more technical thing, because theoretically the icons are actually done, they're just not properly rendering in every page. But this happens all the time in games too. I mean, probably to a more egregious degree, where besides like more, I guess, like QC, quality control related issues, like, texture resolution disparities or lighting bugs or whatever, which are just like ubiquitous, clipping, obviously. There's also just like when you try to filter all of that through, or when you get a rare scene that isn't plagued by so many of those issues, you're still not really looking at anything cohesive. And I know this is a particular like bugbear for you
Yes.
So I would be curious as to if you have any thoughts on how you're tackling that in a 3D environment. I mean, that's the whole idea of the third dimension, 3D. 3D is really bad for art in general. So how did you, like, what kind of things do you look for in a game that, like, has reasonable or acceptable, maybe not just QC on the art, but also the art direction? Like, is there any game that you've played that's, like, you've at least fragments of it have qualified, or is it pretty much all a mess? Like, what's your take generally on that?
I think Dragon's Dogma is actually the only, like, when I think of maybe like DMC3, DMC1, Dragon's Dogma. Those are really the only 3D games I've played that I would say that their art direction was really any good, any solid. But the PS2 titles, they fall into the category of being, well, that platform wasn't ready for 3D. Nobody should have been making 3D games at that point, but they were. And it was a disaster. And it's a disaster to present day. On the PS2, it's really hard to make anything look good. And especially deviating away from the things that are tried and true and do look good, like, 2D. We just dive into the meme that is 3D because, 3D looks better, as one of the fucking Antioch people said, is it just looks better. Like...
Well,
I still remember, and I don't remember too much from the back in the day. My brain rot's pretty strong. There's one memory. I remember there was this guy I used to talk to way back when I was a wee little shit. I think it was like, well, this was when the N64 was new, so it was quite a while ago. I remember when I was watching him go through Star Fox 64 for the first time, and I think it was one of the end cinematics. He was all captivated by it, because this was one of those in-game ones. He says, wow, this is beautiful. And I remember looking at the bulbous faces and the meshes back then, and I remember thinking, this doesn't really look that good. Like, I was just I don't know anything. I think... Well, that was before. I don't honestly remember my timelines, but I think that was before I ever really got into computers. And I was just doing like the comics and the writing and the VHS and other kinds of voice acting back then. Never really got into digital until way later on, around 1998. So I at the time still recognized that it just didn't really look that good. Because of all the shortcuts you had to take to make it 3D, you just had to make it look like shit. Mm-hmm. And that's the problem all the way up to 2022, is 3D just looks like shit. It's all the corners being cut. See, the thing is that computers to these days, and computers for a long time, the actual processing power of the computer is fucking insane. The things that your CPU can do, the things that your GPU can do, is fucking insane. The power in your system today was considered absolutely unimaginable by like 10, 15 years ago. Yeah. It's literally a supercomputer. And somehow, when we should have been advancing software to keep up with that, we've regressed. Games look worse today than they did 15, 20 years ago. They perform worse today than they did 15, 20 years ago. What have we gotten in exchange for that? Nothing. Nothing. There's no computer AI. There's certainly no gameplay. There's nothing filling the holes. It's just people have gotten lazier. And one of the main problems with 3D in general, and the reason why I look to something like these older titles like Dragon's Dogma or whatever, is not just the consistency thing. It's the fact that they try to mask over their laziness with post-processing. Let's take a look at those shitty Doom reboots, for example. What is Doom? It's just a bunch of low-resolution crap that looks like it came out something 20 years ago, but they threw on shit tons of post-processing, temporal anti-aliasing you can't get rid of. The sharpening filters to try to compensate for temporal anti-aliasing, because we got to blur the image and then try to resharpen a blurred image afterwards. Like, the whole logic behind that never made a damn lick of sense. Screen space reflections. We had actual reflections back in the PS2. That's just disappeared today in 2022. It's so rare to even see a simple plein air reflection, and they're usually displayed at a lower frame rate and a lower resolution. I remember playing Ico, a shitty game. But man, the visuals, it had fucking reflections. Ico, this really crappy science fair game with no actual gameplay, had actual reflections in it. Pop into Doom Eternal, Dumb Eternal, there isn't a single functional reflection in that entire product. It looks like shit. It looks like absolute shit. There's so many reasons for that, well beyond the scope of getting into this. But the thing is it just looks like shit. You look at it, it's a noisy mess, and it's incredibly inconsistent. I go to Dragon's Dogma as my example of a 3D game that is maybe not, that's PS3, and it performs like absolute shit. But the graphics are fairly consistent. There's definitely some major flaws in it, and when you go into Bitter Black Isle, or anything where Itsuno had more influence, it quickly goes downhill in quality because Itsuno is synonymous with low quality. But the earliest stages of Dragon's Dogma, the first half of it, before he really went on a rampage, even though Dragon's Dogma was built and then rebuilt within the extent of like 6 months or something, and I'm pretty sure it's just using a bunch of generic stock textures for half of it shit, all the world's environment looks fairly consistent. It looks quite reasonable. And the thing is that you can have a 3D game that is fairly low resolution. It doesn't have to be all 8K textures and whatever. But all the texel density has to be consistent with each other, and nobody does this. Nobody does this. You've got the Blizzard syndrome, where they've got a rock that's like the size of a Zergling, but they need a boulder in their map that's as big as a command center. So what do? They upscale it, and then everything gets fucked. Or you have the other problem where they do this, they apply a world tiling texture, but they don't add anything into the tiling texture to break up the tiling, which, by the way, is not difficult at all. So then you get the fucking tiling textures everywhere. 3D is really not that much more difficult than 2D to get looking good for certain genres and certain camera angles. The problem is nobody actually does it because none of their audience has any standards. So you just get basically what Blizzard does. They outsource to a bunch of third-party companies, or people on DeviantArt in many cases. They congregate all these extremely shitty assets with horrible UV wrapping, awful texel density, inconsistent colors, inconsistent roughness values, or in the case of, DirectX 9 with StarCraft 2, the fucking specularity, the glossiness and all that, it's all just fucking all over the place. You got the Zerg, which is just a disaster. And they don't actually sit down and look at this. They don't unit test the individual graphics, and they don't put the graphics beside each other. And so you get StarCraft 2. StarCraft 2 is one of the most inconsistent 3D products I've seen in a long time. I'm going to say, for example, Diablo 3 or Conan for the PSA just look like absolute ass. It's not just that they're not taking advantage of modern hardware, because none of these games even make the effort to do so. Is that they just look like shit. They just, like, the very presentation, regardless of performance, looks like shit. Look at this Zerg. They're just a bunch of this bulbous, grotesque, incomprehensible shapes. Under this masquerade of making things readable, they make things less readable because the shapes aren't recognizable. And since they don't look aggressive, they're not triggering those monkey feelings inside your brain. Because there's something called... I'm going to pronounce this incorrectly, but I believe it's called like Bassettian mimicry or something like that, or Bastettian mimicry. I can't remember it. Basically, when I was researching these strange wasps that were in my backyard, I'd never seen them before. I was trying to figure out what the hell they were. And you learn about this when you research these things, because you've got a lot of flies, you've got beetles, you've got everything that they got these colors on them, like especially like black and yellow, because those are warning colors. That's what wasps and bees and stuff have. And then animals, through evolution, they've learned that these colors are dangerous. That's why you got the bright colored caterpillars, bright colored frogs, even plants and fruit and some stuff like that, non-predatory ones, will hide amidst them, trying to mimic these colors. Evolution has taught them this. And the reason why they've done that is because your visual senses see these things and they recognize a threat. There's a reason why you have aggressive silhouettes, non-aggressive silhouettes, and stuff like that. With the vast majority of 3D games, the whole concept of building silhouettes just doesn't exist in them. Because, A, they're so low budget, so scraping at the bottom of the barrel for any little bit of frame rate, like way back in, say, Final Fantasy VII, where the hands and everything blocks, the old N64 blocky hands. I'm still seeing products being released for Unreal 4 that have those N64 blocky hands and feet in them. Jesus Christ. That's just like one example, but it's like that fights the whole readability thing. is when the shapes and the proportions are absolutely fucked. And that's StarCraft 2's problem. It's one of the reasons why StarCraft 2 is so hard to read. It's not just the noise between the inconsistent specularity and everything else and the depth issues that 3D presents. It's also the fact that none of the shapes are inherently recognizable. They don't have character to them. They don't have identity to them. They all just kind of blob together literally and figuratively. And since you're not triggering the big monkey feels about this is threatening, I need to pay attention to it, I need to watch it, that's just another layer of confusion that's added onto your brain. Now, with Dragon's Dogma, you have more realistic texturing and kind of color to it. But it's also the fact that the lighting is done more properly as well. Now, one of the biggest issues with games, 3D games in particular, is not just the textile density and the actual assets. It's the fact that just about no game, from Dumb Eternal and beyond, has shadow casting lights in any substantial quality. Most 3D games just fill their world with non-shadow casting lights. And that's because in 2022, we still haven't reached an age where we can have a lot of lights on the screen. The whole point of derp-furred rendering was to be able to put more lights on the screen. Well, it turns out you can't do that because when your engine and your product is so grotesquely inefficient as it is, the second you start putting something into the scene that is actually computationally expensive, like shadow casting, the whole thing just goes and falls up its ass. And what do you know? All the products look like absolute shit. Nothing is casting any shadows, so depth reading is even fucking harder. The entire point of having 3D to begin with just kind of evaporates in an instant. And what do you know? Now you really have no justification for having 3D at all. You're not taking advantage of any of the things that 3D could offer you, particularly in something like a first-person or a third-person game, as opposed to something like StarCraft 2, where you can, well, certainly fake your way around a lot of the shadows. Then you just start asking all these questions. All these things just compound and pile up each other. It's not just like a lack of art direction, it's a lack of giving a shit.
So one of the things that I always think about in this context is, you said earlier that there's a problem with 3D games using like post-processing and other shortcuts to try to mask laziness. And this reminds me of, there was a quote that I heard recently, I can't remember the source, that rasterization is basically a stack of faking value or depth or quality or detail. And it's like, can we make it so that rasterized 3D games, just like, can we basically put in enough hacks to like get an output image that is relatively realistic or like immersive or whatever, and consistent with what the player might expect or what have you. And that to me really sums it up.
You're going to have to tell me what this rasterization thing is, because I think I've heard it in the context of a few things, but my definition might be different.
It's how graphics have always been generated up until the point of ray tracing. So it's the fact that you need lighting as a separate thing, and you have like...
Is this like a screen space thing, or what is it?
No, it's just like in using deferred rendering or even forward rendering. It's just like not using ray tracing to accomplish the render, which is based. So it's how everything has been done. Like even technically 2D games are also raster graphics, but the idea is that when you're talking in the context of 3D, the way that they're trying to get depth and all this other stuff, because they can't just have the image appear true using the ray tracing method, which I'm not really, for clarity, I don't think ray tracing is necessarily the future, but that's more of a hardware thing, because you would have to like eat up.
Well, you see, that's the thing, is that's the big distance between games and then a pre-built render, like a pre-rendered cinematic, is the ray tracing.
Yes. Yeah.
You've had ray tracing in those renders for, I say at least like 30 years, probably longer.
Right, yeah. That's the main difference, is that it's real-time ray tracing can achieve something basically like equivalent to these ray traced renders that are done through like pre-rendered cinematics or whatever.
But this is the funny thing about ray tracing, is you have NVIDIA that has their whole RTX thing.
Yeah.
And in every single one of their fucking demonstrations for their ray tracing, they blow out all the other post-processing. They just make an absolute mess of the fucking image. They just turn to absolute utter puke. And they have, of course, NVIDIA's DLSS or whatever it is. Their
oh man, I have so many rants to go off of on this thing. I'm sure you do too. So anytime you're talking about upscaling an image,
it's like they have They increase the frame rate by
or
filling it with
downscaling
fucked
whatever.
frames.
Yeah.
With fucked frames that produce artifacting in them that temporal anti-aliasing would blush at.
Yeah.
Like, it is absolutely an utterly worthless waste of resources. You want to talk about people trying to keep job permanence? It's all the trash that NVIDIA keeps puking out that contributes absolutely nothing to software or hardware.
Well, that's the thing, is that, like, you were saying earlier that software, there's another point I wanted to remind people of, is that, like, hardware has taken leaps and bounds. Software, on the other hand, is like, I don't know, it's like the retarded cousin you have to drag along to the family dinner or something. He's just, like, making a mess of everything, and he's not doing anything properly.
Just look at web development.
Yeah. Well, there you go.
Web development encapsulates everything. Games are web development at this point.
And you said
that's
earlier
the most
that
horrifying fucking thing you could ever imagine, and yet that's where we are. People use Chrome in their game. Just fucking sit on that and spin.
Thanks, Remastered. So, no, that's the thing, though. It's like, it goes a step further than that, because you were saying earlier as well that, like, your read on in the situation is that, like, games now look worse than they did before, and they perform worse, and it feels like, you know, your reaction was that they just got lazier. But, like, to an extent, that's true, and also to an extent, it's become normalized, and thirdly, to an extent, because it's actually harder to make a game now because of all of the software regressions. So it's like the software regressions aren't just in the game; it's also in the engine or the tools or whatever you're working with.
It's in the industry.
It's in the
it's in the whole educational process. Like, that's one of the main things that holds engines like Unreal back. Is there's just not really a lot of programmers out there who know how to do low-level stuff, and much less do it competently. And when you go to the average game developer today, they don't have programmers. They don't have people who understand this faintest fucking thing about their engines. Whereas before, like 20, 30 years ago, especially when you were building for consoles, you had to understand at least a little bit about the engine. You had to understand at least a little bit what your code is compiling into. Nowadays, most people don't even look at code. Most people are fucking terrified of code. Most people think that Lua and fucking Java and JavaScript are coding a game. They think that you can make a game out of fucking Chromium or something like that.
Yeah,
they don't know
there's a game available on Steam that's made in Chromium. Did you know? It's called Five Nations.
Oh my god, dude! When I was watching your streams for that, I was horrified at your performance. There's like 10 units on the fucking screen, and you're stalling.
I don't even think it's related to the number of units per se. I think it's like pathing and some other shit. There is a point. You would have fucking laughed so hard at some of the bugs that I encountered. Were you privy to the flashbang effect? Did you see that?
No, but I only watched a little bit because it was quite possibly one of the dullest RTSs I've ever seen.
Well,
literally nothing happens in the entire game.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you just skipped around, you wouldn't have seen too much action. But what I really like about that game is how dysfunctional it really is. There was a bug where if you like right-clicked on impassable terrain at just the right thing and it was really easy to trigger, your whole game would infinitely loop trying to do the pathing and it would just freeze, and so you would never be able to do anything. Now, listen, Mesk, their solution to this was to make it so that those units would simply stop working.
Now, see, I just had a bug like that. Yeah. I was just before we did this, I had a bug like that. I'm trying to get teleportation for the Voidhounds to work on the jump points. And for some reason, the teleportation fails on this one jump point because it thinks it can't teleport the unit into this space. So it just sits there teleporting infinitely in the same spot because a navlink keeps triggering.
Right.
And their solution for that would be to just disable everything.
Well, I mean,
really the solution is to branch out and have a fallback.
Yeah, they don't know how to fix the exact issue, but the result was basically them saying, like, well, these units will just have to stop working or something. I don't know why they wouldn't just not process the order at the very least. Like, give me my units still. But now the units can attack, they just can't move. I don't know what the fuck it is. I don't even think they understand how they broke that way. But
well, they're using Chromium. I don't think they understood anything.
So the flashbang effect is a separate issue, which is, and we'll get back to the actual topic after this, but it's an amusing anecdote. The flashbang happens when you play enough missions throughout. Every time you load a mission, it creates a 500 megabyte memory leak, and after a certain point, they have too much RAM usage for the game, and it shows you a full white screen, and you have to close the game. So After like 8 missions, that just happens always. They've described it as a load-bearing memory leak. Or something to those.
Memory leak.
That's our term for it, at least. I mean, like, they literally said if we remove that, the game will just start crashing randomly or something.
Wow. Oh my god. You know, when you reach a point where you've got a load-bearing memory leak and you don't even know what you're doing with your pathing, you got to cut your losses and just start over from scratch. Just throw it all out and just start over, because chances are in like a month of time, you'll have retraced all your steps and you'll have something better.
Well, don't worry. The main guy who's not the programmer, but the main guy responsible for this product is thinking that he'll make a multiplayer version in Unity and use 3D.
Oh, yes.
Because
Unity has such great, reliable netcode in every product that's ever been released for it that you don't have to either build yourself from scratch or purchase at an insane fee and therefore run a gamble because it's untested.
Classic.
Good luck. Good luck with that. I look forward to that. That's going to bring some great bugs. Netcode is not something anybody just fucks into when they don't know what they're doing.
Yeah, well, and they definitely seem qualified for the job, having experienced their load-bearing memory leaks. So.
I'm sure they will produce art in some shape or fashion.
Yeah, it just reminds me of Deadly Premonition, which is a game I still think you should do a Let's Play of. And the
it sounds familiar.
It's not. That's the American name for it, but like, yeah, you have to play the English version because I don't like the. it's just impeccable, but like there's like a scene early on where you like crash your car as you're arriving. You're an FBI agent and you crash your car and your arrival. I think so, actually, towards the end. And
oh, good.
During that, there's supposed to be sounds of like chipmunks or something, but they make like monkey noises, so we called them chipmonkeys. I don't know. There's like that's like the least insane part of the game, and that's just at the beginning. So like the whole experience is a real treat. But I remember reading the Wikipedia article for that game afterwards, and it said something like, "Oh, people have cited Deadly Premonition as like evidence that games can be art," and Patrick agreed because he said that game made him feel things he didn't know he could feel, and you know, so there you go. But you know, I have been playing Red Dead Redemption 2 lately, although not in the single player mode, in the online mode, and this is a weird experience because it's like this ridiculously high budget title. And they're very clearly going for this realistic experience and this vibe of like, you know, this is what it looks like for if you were to travel back. It's like an ancestor simulation, bro, or something. Like that's the vibe you get. Is like it's supposed to be realistic or accurate. Setting aside the horse physics, which are hilarious, you just have to think about like, I mean, and also the netcode. There's what made me think about it because it was such a disaster.
You say Red Dead Redemption 2. I just remember the video of a guy. Has a guy like on a lasso or a whip or something like that, and he's dragging and he just sits on a train and the guy's just like gliding around behind the train. Just like in the air, and they just land and he gets up.
Yeah, it's fine. Well, people suffer horrendous, heinous injuries in that game and then just walk up. So whatever.
Yeah, Rockstar and their attempts to create realistic games have always been ceaselessly entertaining. Yeah. I've played Red Dead Redemption 1, not 2. Again, just same as you, just as the multiplayer.
Yeah, I haven't played. Oh, I didn't even know the first game had multiplayer.
I don't know if you've ever seen that XXE I have, where there's a cart, and you like bump into the cart with a horse, and the cart just projectiles into the fucking sun.
That's actually,
or the
I didn't
horse
know that was
flying off a
art,
cliff, falling 300 feet and just getting back up again without sliding around on the ground.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, my brother said that if you try to use Deadeye on a bird with dynamite, it just becomes a homing missile, which is pretty entertaining to think about. So there's all sorts of like wacky shit. But even if you set aside the gameplay, which is obviously a pretty big part of the game, and you just look at the visuals, what really struck me is that like there are moments where if you're like, because of all of the fucking post-processing, it's actually hard to focus on stuff. And then it makes you think like, oh, maybe this is actually like from a very, like you just glance back at your main monitor after looking at something else. And then you're like, oh, wait, is this actually like a good looking scene? Or is this actually a realistic immersive area? But then like you start to focus in on stuff as it like, obviously it stops you from doing that immediately because it's not really trying to be readable at all. And when you do focus in on stuff, everything falls apart. But the reason why that happens is that like they're attempting to hit such a high threshold, but they're doing it with really like poor individual assets or whatever. They can't really be.
The scene is noisy.
Yeah, well, it's noisy, but it's also impossible to focus on. And then there's all this disparity, like you talked about, differences between texel density between if you're looking at different objects. You talked about the example of StarCraft 2 where they would scale stuff up, but then it should have been small. We all remember the Antioch Chronicles 3 where we got zoomed into a nexus by zooming in, and we could basically count the fucking pixels on the texture as it was zooming in. I don't know why they would put that right in front of the camera, but shit like that happens in AAA games. So at that point, they're not even really bucking the trend that much. Like, it's slightly less pomp and circumstance than you might expect from a camera angle in a video game, but only slightly less. Like, it is noticeably a fan project, but there are moments in pretty much every game that feel only a little bit less stupid than that. Sometimes
I like Conan, where the camera in the boss fight just is behind like the rooftop of a building, and all the top pieces of the building are back-faced, right? Just literally right in front of you on the Sand Dragon, I think it was.
Okay. So,
yeah, no, see, the thing is a lot of these games would actually look a lot better in spite of their asset quality if you disable temporal anti-aliasing, you disable motion blur, you disable whatever sharpening filter they've got, you disable limb darkening, aka vignette, or however the fuck you pronounce that. You disable the tone mapping because tone mapping is gross and unnecessary. You disable the fucking auto exposure because that's disgusting.
Eye adaptation.
Set the boom back to a neutral value. Set lens flares. People always go on about lens flares. I think lens flares can work for some stuff. You set those back to a very low value. You know, you just put things, just make a neutral scene. Just make it. But the problem is in a lot of these games, and especially those games, is that you get all these assets you phoned in. And they may be high resolution or whatever, but then they're inconsistent because one studio made one asset, one studio made another asset, this asset's from your library. Rather than edit the assets and try to tint their colors to be the same or whatever, they apply fucking tone mapping to them instead. And then that tone mapping gets divided by volumes. This is one of the things I really hate about games. You see this way back in like fucking Dark Souls. Is you go into an area, suddenly everything changes color because you've entered a post-processing volume with a tone map assigned to it.
Dude, you remember the poison area in Dark Souls 1 where just everything becomes Call of Duty green or whatever the fuck? Like, that was so nauseating.
And, you know, this isn't just games, too. It's also fucking Blu-ray releases where they've got to apply this fucking tone map, this tint to everything that ever goes on a Blu-ray or whatever because it makes it more edgy. Skyrim Green is another classic one. You have to basically go out of your way to find post-process recalibrated videos to find something that isn't shaded out in this pukey yellow or whatever. Like, a lot of these games, like Dumb Eternal, when I figured out you can turn off temporal anti-aliasing through the console. Suddenly you can see what's going on. Suddenly textures have definition. As low res as they are, now it looks like maybe like Alice Madness Returns level. You know, like PS2, PS3 kind of tech. But it looked so much better than it was. And it's so simple. It's so simple. Because none of those assets are tuned for a world without temporal anti-aliasing. Temporal anti-aliasing is supposed to deal with something called shader aliasing. Well, it really doesn't. It just makes everything fucked up, and it doesn't fix edge aliasing either. And you can tune your materials to not have shader aliasing. It's actually really easy. Just clamp your roughness, sometimes clamp your specularity. Rare cases, you got to clamp your normal maps. Very uncommon, like 1 in 1,000. And this is fucking easy shit to do. Oh, suddenly you no longer have fucking... They're called fireflies. There's actually a technical term for this stupid issue that shows up with PBR. And, I mean, honestly, PBR is kind of a meme into itself. But all these post-processing does is it just blurs, washes out, distracts, muddies the image. You can't even appreciate what's there.
Well, that's probably my biggest complaint, and the reason why I think, going back to the Red Dead Redemption angle, it's like, when your standard is trying to be like realistic, real life, visual, or whatever, or something that's like approximating it and is like the biggest thing to any game, regardless of their intended goal for visuals, is consistency. It's the idea that like these assets were made for this or edited to be like this, and they are built for this purpose in some way or molded to this purpose in some way. And that's where we get into art direction. But it also is like, you know, you could actually see them, which seems like a really obvious technical thing you would want to make sure is true. You can take in the assets and understand what they are, really soak them in, drink them in. One of the most exciting aspects of a 3D game used to be exploring a world, but now it's just like annoying to look at. So I don't even think that that's something that people really think about too much. I'm sure some people are still thinking about that.
And it's always sectioned off and linear on top of it.
Right, you'd think that some of these open world style games like Red Dead Redemption or Assassin's Creed franchises, GTA even, like if it was about exploring a world, you would want that world to look readable and understandable and consistent so that you would know where you are and you would know what you're looking at. And, then you would also want, obviously, quality would be up there. But if their only goal is like matching Hollywood or some shit, then, that's not even a good standard for realism, because the whole point of it standard. Is like it's not, it's hyper realistic or, fucking unintelligible or whatever, depending on which movie you're talking about. But you wouldn't want to go after that standard if your goal was to make something that was actually it's incoherent to me what they're even trying to do. I can't really reverse engineer the goal. And I think, usually that's a sign that the goal isn't actually singular. It's not unified. These people are like just trying to, maybe the goal is to collect a paycheck, or the goal is to not rock the boat too much at work. And the goal is to, just do your side of the job and just make your asset, or just apply your post-processing as the higher ups decreed. But it doesn't feel like there's any cohesive vision. It doesn't feel like there's, obviously the direction side of things is lacking, but these games also, because of their impossibly high standard, given the tech that we have right now, and that is mostly due to software, as we mentioned, it's not due to the hardware. Because of that, we are in a situation where it's better for you to have, broadly speaking, your ceiling of your asset quality should be closer to your floor, and they should be pretty consistent. And if you can do that, then it doesn't really matter if your floor is, not as high as your ceiling was. If they're in the same range where the asset quality doesn't, and nothing really sticks out as being that not from this game. It can be, otherworldly if that's the art direction for it. It can be really distinct. It can stand out in that sense. But as long as we're not looking at it thinking it was taken from another source, or it was not fit for purpose for this title, then that part is done. And it is a simple job. Your point about Doom Eternal, when you turn off the post-processing, when you turn off temporal anti-aliasing, you get this image that is at least significantly more digestible, significantly more understandable. And that is the first step towards building a world that actually looks interesting, compelling, something you want to explore, something you at least don't mind looking at the very least, even if it's the direction is super generic, or things are not super great from that angle. At the very least, I can actually see what it is and I can evaluate it. But if you can't even do that because of the post-processing and the temporal and all this other shit, then at that point you've made stuff, but I remember thinking when I was playing one of the Assassin's Creed games where there's literally clipping in every scene, every scene had clipping. I remember thinking, there were man hours put into this product. There were people who made textures and models and did animations and did motion capture for these cutscenes and all this other shit. But it's all fallen apart because I can't even focus on any of what they've actually done due to these bugs. It's now with all this post-processing and all this extra level layer stuff that's masking whatever they're insecure about, they've done the same thing as that Assassin's Creed game, but it's every game that's released with a high budget. And it's also not because of a bug, it's intended. They intended to make it so that nobody can focus on what's the work that's been done. And now the general philosophy that I see from most people, I think most gamers forget that somebody actually worked on what they are looking at. Most people must think it's just this amorphous, artificial intelligence blob generation or something. I don't know. And maybe it feels that way, but it's you got to remember that people were paid for this whole purpose, and people were paid to create this product and all of its elements. And, a lot of asset theft undoubtedly goes on between these companies. But the point is, this was all generated by humans as far as we know. And maybe that's a little bit different now, but for the longest time, it was always true that this shit was generated by humans, and it was put into the product by humans. And that part is definitely still true. So just thinking about that is just, it really opens your eyes to how lazy some of these examples really are, or how not fit for purpose they are, even if they weren't necessarily lazy. It's just they weren't fit for purpose for this title, and now we're looking at a game that has like really terrible art direction, and I can't even understand like what these assets were meant to be because of all the post-processing. And so I think the Doom Eternal example is really good, because when you do disable all that shit, it doesn't become a great looking game, but it becomes a game you can look at, and that's the at least one step towards the like a promised land of something that you actually want to look at.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's honestly, deferred rendering has been a disaster for gaming. It's always just been a race down to the bottom ever since we switched away from forward. And it's an evolutionary dead end, and people are just unwilling to accept that. They're unwilling to go back and just do things right, like leverage hardware to deal with lighting in a different way, to use actual anti-aliasing. Like fucking MSAA has been busted in Unreal 4 since like 2015. And forward has just been abandoned. Now, VR is a meme, but VR did highlight for a lot of people just how bad deferred rendering and temporal and everything related is, because you literally just can't use those in VR, because you absolutely have to have a responsive image in VR, or it fucks your eyes. It makes you really motion sick.
Yep.
You don't get responsive images out of deferred. You don't. Not with any of the screen space crap. Not with temporal. So you had to use forward. You had to use MSAA. And then you realize, wait a second, this really hasn't been developed at all. But of course, Epic is way too focused on like Fortnite. So none of that stuff ever gets worked on, because that's why recast and everything has never been worked on, is because it's just Fortnite that drives the engine development. And it's really sad. It is really, really sad, because you can look back to these older titles. I mean, like Lineage 2 is a nice example I like to go to, where the art direction in there was pretty solid as like ancient, like Unreal 2, Unreal Warfare engine. And it looked good. It looked good. Requiem Bloody Mare was Gamebryo, I think, like in the art direction of these older Korean titles look pretty good. But then we went to more modern stuff where they just turned all lazy and cartoony. And the ones that tried to be sort of realistic, they just get immersed in this swath of garbage. And then they all became lazy. And then it just, the Asian meme of having high quality graphics just vanished in an instant. And Unreal 3 was like their last hurrah, and then we just really don't see it too much anymore. There was that Wukong game that might have been interesting, but I don't know too much about it. And it's sad. It's definitely very sad. And realism is a trap, because like my game is trying to be realistic, but it should be very obvious right off the bat that I'm not chasing the photorealism dream, because that just is paired up with all the post-processing and tone mapping. People try to tone map still images out of it and then call it realistic. And then the actual product in itself is an utter disaster. Something that you should be chasing instead is believability. And you can believable in an anime style, you can be believable in something realistic. But when you chase the photorealism, you realize you will never reach it. And then you start taking shortcuts, and then you start trying to hide things, and then you stop caring. And that's kind of like, that's the problem you see with all these. Quite frankly, just about every Unreal project that I've looked at on YouTube tries to be realistic. And they don't even attempt to do the lighting portion at all. And it just immediately out of the gate. I remember I was watching a video the other day on a guy talking about Unreal 5 and beginner's tips for like lighting and stuff like that. And the first thing he says is turn off auto exposure. And no, none of these, all commercial games have been using auto exposure for a long time, or some implementation of it, even as far back as the PS2. And it always looks fucking terrible. It just looks fucking terrible. You want to manually set up your exposure, and nobody does that because they're lazy. And the thing that you were saying about different people in the companies is the biggest issue with companies beyond individual skills or consistency or whatever is the fact that none of the parts of the body talk to each other. Companies are filled with literally hundreds of people that are, in many cases, hyper specialized in their job, where they do just the one thing and it gets passed off to someone else. And there's no intercommunication between them. And the team leaders are weak and have no spine and no balls. And when people have no balls, they don't try to wrangle all the various limbs to doing something consistent with each other. Even if those people could and wanted to actually work with each other, these companies are so subdivided and so autonomous in many ways that they don't even see their work when other people are working on it. And the team leader doesn't do any synchronization for them. There's an infamous quote from Bill Roper of Blizzard North saying that each programmer has their own style and he just kind of lets them do what they want. Well, what do you know? Lord of Destruction is a fucking buggy-ass disaster beyond imagination. You guys working on StarCraft don't realize how easy it is, how good it is, compared to what Blizzard North shat together. It just turned an already massive train wreck in Lord of Destruction. Just a colossal disaster. And Blizzard South, after the point, like, the thing is that Blizzard North was tremendously more competent than Blizzard South in basically every way, except for the programmatic stuff at that point, because it was like I think there's a story behind it. It's like a skeletal team and a bunch of interference from Blizzard South making things worse. And that infamous article that they censored, in their own words, was talking about how every time Blizzard South got involved with their work, it was bad. And of course, all the products afterwards were a disaster, and then you had Hellgate London, which was an absolute disaster. And that mindset's a part of it. And designer Dave gives such an incredible window of insight to the colossal incompetence behind these massive, massive developers with armies, legions of people building games and all fighting in completely different directions, all of them completely incompetent, nobody communicating whatsoever, and no leadership wrangling them. You can have a team of completely different skilled people who can only do X or Y or Z, and you can make that work. But you have to have strong leadership. You have to have leadership with a strong vision that will not bend, that will not do stuff because somebody feels a certain way. They have a vision, and they make people work for that vision. If they don't work for it, they get fired, and you find somebody else, because God knows that the industry is just flooded with capable talent out there. It's just waiting to actually be used, and nobody makes use of it.
Yeah, the biggest takeaway for me from actually trying to look a little bit behind the scenes for some of this stuff too is like the biggest, I think you just like we've talked about with designers or programmers, artists also don't seem to ever get directed, pointed feedback, or even necessarily, like you said, they don't even necessarily see their work in the final scene, maybe until release, or maybe a little bit before then. By that point, it's already like locked up and you can't do anything to it. So they don't really know what the problems are necessarily, right? And that's down to company structure. And you know, when you have these like enormous teams, I was actually, funnily enough, talking about this with Veek recently. There's companies out there with thousands of programmers, and I just can't imagine why you would ever need that many programmers for any one task. Like, it gets worse the more people you stack on, guys. It doesn't get better. Nope. It's not, you can't just like throw numbers of people at the problem. You know, it takes us back to the Blizzard example and like some of your older content where you used to talk about them throwing interns at the problem. It's like, yeah, that's really what they're doing though. They're basically just taking these people who are less qualified, more naive, still think that they're like doing great things at Blizzard. Meanwhile, all their fucking breast milk's getting stolen out of the fridge, and then they're just like, "What's going on here? Why is this game buggy as fuck? Oh, is it because I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm being told to just throw myself at this problem?" Yeah, it might be. Mm-hmm. So it just gets sillier the longer you think about it as like a serious idea behind a serious company or something. Like, you can't take companies with that sort of structure very seriously, and it's pretty easy to know that just by looking at their products. But the more you dig in and the more you like uncover about what's going on behind the scenes at these companies, the more stories we hear from people like designer Dave, or the more quotes we hear from like Brevik, I think his name is, who's like, you know, drunk on stream playing Path of Exile. It's just like, you know, these little windows of insight into the company. They can be very interesting, and indeed, I think that they just end up showing exactly what we already knew, for lack of a better term. You know, it's just like we're already aware of all this stuff, guys. And just like Blizzard is aware of all of the problems and doesn't intend to fix them, I don't know if we can really fix them either. But like, consumers should, I always like to think about it like the gamers who are buying these games should try to like demand something better. But it's really hard to know that there could be something better if you're not like spending a lot of time researching and investigating stuff, right? It's hard today, yeah. Yeah, if you don't ever look at what content was like, then you don't realize just how much you're missing out on today. People today probably think that microtransactions are okay. Well, it's definitely been normalized at the very least, and so when you announce it, even if it's like disappointing or reaffirming that that's just the trend, it is just saying like, hey, yeah, there's you don't have any other recourse, man. You just gotta experience the microtransaction, dude. It's the only way. So that's just I mean, obviously, there's like sad examples of people begging other like companies to add
Oh
microtransactions,
my
which
gosh.
is just like that's like when you're literally being
Especially
like
when it's a
abused.
subscription based game. You see that
Yeah,
often with Final Fantasy 14. It is some of the most mind blowing shit. It's a game that struggles to have any content in it at all, and people want them to add the content to the cash shop. Like, I think it's kind of like the consumerist mindset where they just don't really want to ever have to work for something. They'd rather just spend daddy's money on it.
I hope it's daddy's money because if it's their money, what the fuck are they doing? Like, do you remember that there was this like offhanded quote where somebody was like, I like, why would I spend why would I invest $1,000 into this game if I feel like there was some, I don't even remember the rest of the sentence because I'm already laughing to the moon.
Yeah, I think I remember what you were talking about.
Based on the first part of that sentence alone. Yeah, it's like I would never like if I should only invest that if I feel like the game can last a long time. I don't know, some insane shit like that. It's like all right, buddy. Why would you ever spend $1,000 on a game? Like, I just can't imagine that. Like, what game has offered that much value to you? It better be a game that you've been playing for like 20 years. and
See,
even
my
then,
margin is StarCraft. StarCraft costed me about $20, I think, and I got probably, I couldn't even begin to imagine, but it was like 12 years of nearly non-stop focus on StarCraft with some deviation like Diablo 2 and Warcraft 3 and stuff, but still very largely StarCraft. So it's definitely like in the tens of thousands, possibly even like 100,000 hours. And well, maybe not 100,000. I'm thinking more like, I don't know, but it's, it was my life, right? It was my life for a long time. Long time. We're talking dusk to dawn, month after month after month. That to me is the margin for how much $20 is worth. No game is ever going to approach that, but they should try to, because that's how valuable money actually is. People don't respect the value of their money today because I couldn't even begin to imagine why, but they don't. It's something I've noticed a lot, especially with the younger generations, is they just don't value their money. Like the example I've given a few times of the person I used to talk to who paid for shit in FGO, spending like $900 a pop on crap and liquidating coins and stuff for it. Like, I just can't fathom spending any more than $20, $30 on a game. I can fathom you spending that much or more on assets to make a game. I've spent quite a bit at this point, but that's because you're making something, you're building something, and the sum of that parts is far greater than what an actual individual game is worth. And in some respects, you could almost think of that with StarCraft. But the thing with StarCraft is I was the pioneer of StarCraft. I had to learn everything on my own. It was all my investment that made that time what it was. So the value of the game in that sense, there's no way you could ever argue that makes it more valuable monetarily. No, if anything, I should have been paid money for the amount of time I put into making a product more than it was. But, objectively speaking, a modder should never be paid a single dime. It's a hobby. And at no point should that ever warrant the product being more expensive. And paying for any of that, any extent, microtransactions, mods, any of the shit, is just unbelievably, absolutely insane. You don't realize how valuable that money actually is. Individual assets for a consumer of a game are valued in pennies. And if you're paying more than pennies, you're being ripped off. Plain and simple. Games today are easier than ever to make what they are. Assets are easier than ever to make. And people are paying more for them. And the microtransactions is explicitly and simply marketing. It's marketing, and marketing is all about psychology. That's where the real game development is done and has been done for a very long time, especially in the West. It's exclusively just in marketing. That's where all the finances go. It's where all the research goes. It's why there's so many divisions springing up for dealing with social media and stuff like that. It's why data harvesting is so lucrative. That drives the marketing, and that's why AI is such a big thing. It's not just because people want to use it to make porn. It's being used to drive analysis of psychology. It's being used to drive marketing. There's all those cameras and shops and stuff like that watch your face when you look at products. They analyze your face. They read your expressions. That goes into number crunching. They understand how you respond to forms of marketing, stuff like this. Now, all these are tools, and advertising is a critical part of getting even a decent product off the ground, because you got to get your name out there. But the thing is that nobody, in a world without standards, in a world without people who respect quality, the marketing drives everything, because it's all about identity. It's all about identifying as somebody who has something, who's a part of something, who's consuming something. And at that point, what you're consuming doesn't make a damn of a difference, because you're an epic gamer because you play Call of Duty or Dumb Eternal. Look at me, I'm playing hard games because I play Dark Souls. The actual subject doesn't matter. Your actual experience with it doesn't matter. And thinking about this brings me back to Overwatch and how I watched the most calm gamer bro people I ever met in my entire life. Never once seen them mad. It drove them into a frenzy each and every single time they played within just a couple minutes. Just the experience was just so frustrating, because the game itself is extraordinarily frustrating and unfun to play. But they were the consumerist people who had to tack onto these casual games. And that, just watching that just erode them, was really quite an educational experience. You hear about it all the time with League of Legends and Overwatch and the toxic player base and all this other shit. But to actually sit and watch these two polarities of the most casual consumerist people who are basically unmovable walls of casualism, turn into your average Xbox stereotype, with it literally at the tip of a hat, you realize that there's some deep shit going on that gets them into this point, And then the actual project doesn't stand up. But you know what? It doesn't matter. You paid the money. Well, and they'll never admit that it's a bad game until they reach a breaking point.
Yeah. That's the thing, is that, like, you've paid the money. Well, the new game doesn't require you to pay money, but it does require a phone number, so...
Yeah, I've heard a lot about that, and I think even the casuals are realizing something's up with the way Blizzard's been running their business. To any sane person, it's like they're intentionally trying to sabotage their company as a fuck you to Microsoft.
It could be. I mean, it doesn't seem like they're doing sensible things. You were talking about, the AI analyzing data, and that's really that's why all of these people who are, like, making the argument that, like, oh, there's so much data, it can't all be analyzed. It's like, yeah, well, if they can get a computer module to do it, then actually it doesn't matter.
They hire third parties to process the data too. Like,
oh yeah, there's no.
You don't understand the sheer processing power of server farms. The data is absolutely being sifted through.
Yeah, and that was always the. People didn't necessarily predict in the mainstream that AI would come to fruition and be used in this way, but it's not hard to see that, like, as computers get better and as programmers are able to do more complex things, there would be some solution to this problem of we have too much data.
It's not even that complex.
Right.
Like, the vast majority of AIs, including the visual AIs that are being, talked about today, they're not AI. They're not intelligent. It's just brute force crunching numbers.
It's machine learning.
And those numbers are vast libraries. Vast libraries. If you ever actually sit down and try to use these AI things, I forget the one HKS is messing around with, but any of the ones that people are fucking raging about because shitty artists think they're going to lose their shitty jobs because they're too incompetent to become real artists, to a fucking toaster. These AIs take a massive amount of time to get something out of them that you, as an existing artist, can edit to make decent content with. It's very hard to get something actually functionally useful out of these. And the reason why is because it's dumb. It's not intelligent. There's no intelligence to it whatsoever. It's literally just brute forcing through keywords into a library, and that library has not been sanitized. You get so many issues from libraries. I remember when the whole deepfake thing first showed up, and people were terrified, and there was lawsuits going left and right of deepfake porn and all this shit. And that's not really any better than this, because you still got to build a huge library, and the actual algorithm isn't very good. And you look like HKS was trying to make an alternate portrait for his player character in D&D. Extremely simple stuff, doesn't need to be that big. Really simple, right? It is the most just eldritch horror after eldritch horror. It can't do the most basic things, like it can't separate the hair from the clothing. It doesn't know how to do hands. You try to feed it basic descriptions. You change one thing, the whole thing changes. Like the end user won't be able to make sufficient use out of this for a very, very long time. And now, of course, what you see happening is all these services are springing up that charge you money to use AI generation, and that's just another grift. It's another bait, and people are buying. I don't know if you noticed in CC, but Dessler and Joel Studler showed up literally within I think it's like an hour and a half hour of each other to shill this AI thing. And I think that's some kind of sponsorship deal or something that they're on board with, because these people never visit the forum. They haven't been there for years. They both show up out of nowhere and talk about how this AI is so great and you can make all these things with it. But the thing is that we've used the AI. I've used an AI upscaler. I've used Waifu 2 times, Topaz, something other that got posted before, and a whole bunch of other shit for years now. And yeah, but the thing, of course, is that when you're talking about the psychology thing, honestly, that's probably a lot less complicated than dealing with visuals. Because it's very targeted. And it's been in motion for a long time. And I mean, marketing is it can be a very complex science. And there's certainly a lot of things to get into it, but that data, there's a reason why it's very valuable and why many companies are switching to platforms where they just milk you for data. Like Discord, for example. Discord, you are the product. You are being sold. Every DM you have had on Discord, from the time Discord first launched to present day to forever, is stored in a server in Tencent. And anybody else who has the money for it, it is stored and it is processed. They know everything. Every single thing you ever post on this platform is not private. Never will be private. And there is already cases where that's been dug up for whatever reason. And the founder was tried for antitrust lawsuits for exact same thing in the past. Surprise, surprise, he's right back at it. And make no mistake, every single game and platform you go on is milking your data. And that's very lucrative. Everybody wants that because it's not just marketing, of course, the whole political thing. Google driving the elections and stuff like that and all these things. That's all based on all kinds of things. Information is power, right? So every time you go out into any of these services and you deal with whatever, the whole marketing thing really drives it. And games are a product of that at this point. They are. They're a product of marketing. Marketing is what drives games. When you see, I'm trying to think of some good examples. I mean, pretty much all of Doom Eternal is marketing driven. One of the classic cases, the most basic things I like to go to is the bass drop, the stinger. You probably know precisely what I'm talking about. That is a marketing thing. I, of course, like to bring up the 3-point stands. Of course, the logos and the stuff that people use.
Is the 3-point stand the hero pose where they drop to the ground or whatever?
Yeah, and they got their fist on the ground and they're like on one knee or whatever. Yeah, the superhero pose. Yeah. The wrestler belts, that one gets commonly pointed out to me that all these games have to have the characters doing the wrestler pose with the wrestler belts. And like World of Warcraft's really bad for that.
Where they hold their belt buckle or something? What are they doing?
No, it's just the big ass belts. Big fat belts. That's all the quote unquote stylized games. Have to have the big belts, and then they always do the wrestler pose.
Oversized
enemies always have to do the wrestler pose. And of course 3 as well, as I've abundantly exposed to this group by now. 3 is of course another marketing thing. And I mean, it goes on and on and on, but really, like, the way that this ties into the art direction is you can feel when something is sterilized and processed. You can feel, it's not just about the post-processing, the colors, whatever. You can feel when the experience is sterilized and processed and run through this marketing train. You can feel when this is something that people genuinely give a shit about, which is pretty much no modern game. And you can feel when it is a sterilized hunk of shit that's been run through countless filters to wash off all of the character. And that's why I mentioned corporate art when we first started this. Because Overwatch, League of Legends, all this shit. It is corporate art. It is the game version of corporate art. It's been sterilized to the point to be as absolutely inoffensive as possible, as mute as possible. You can literally smell the hospital fumes coming off of it. You can smell that sterilization coming off of it. It is so bland, and it is as risk-free as possible to be as mass appealing as possible. So it doesn't matter how realistic it looks, how stylized it always looks like shit, because reality is not pleasant and style is not pleasant. And all these games, they always involve combat or events or something like that, but the very process of the motion between things is sterilized. Like, you get, like, even like Doom Eternal, its gore is sterilized. It makes no sense at all. It looks like shit. It's not real gore. It's there because, look, it's a violent game. We have to have gore, but it's not actually gory. It's not actually bloody. What's there is there just to fill that tick box, whatever you call it. Words, English, Canadian. It is just there to be there, right? It doesn't look any good. It doesn't look like a gore. And then you have to have the QTEs, the kill sequences to show in your face, look, it's a violent game. But the general game in itself is not violent. It's sterilized. It's inoffensive. The enemies are all inoffensive cartoon cutouts. They look like shit. There's not a shred of originality in any of the engagement whatsoever. And most of the times you die in that game, it's the stuff you don't even see or hear.
Yeah, the gore is slapstick. It's not impactful. Yeah. I mean,
there's none of that actual threat. You don't ever actually feel threatened in that game. You feel threatened by bugs and inconsistency and the complete lack of a soundstage. And
then at the same time, there's no satisfaction to the moves you're pulling off. Like when you actually are in a QTE mini cutscene to like rip off some dude's head or whatever, that's not
it's
satisfying.
Just an animation you got to sit through.
Yeah, you haven't done anything. Like,
look, I pushed a button. Now the game's playing itself for a while. May as well go take a piss.
When I was talking about Red Dead Redemption, like to its credit, at least, when you do pull off something that like decapitates somebody or whatever, like there are moments in there where it's like, oh, there for a second I actually felt something. Like there's there's the matter of fact nature perhaps, and also the fact that it's because of your input and not because of a cutscene. Yep. Like the gameplay isn't very good because it is much more like cinematics, like over like your player input or whatever. There's like auto aim and all this other slapstick shit. But like I recently unlocked I found a hatchet, and you can throw this cleaver thing. It's called cleaver, but it looks more like an axe. And you can throw it as or just attack with it like a melee weapon. And I've to the point of it being slapstick, I have just started chucking it at like anybody I see, and it's it flies through the air and then like one hit KOs them. They're just dead. But there's like there's the little moments in there where it's like, oh, this time I hit him in the back of the skull, and it was like, oh shit, that actually it was a bit grisly, a bit I wasn't expecting that or whatever. And so like there's fragments of it there where obviously if it was a game that maybe was a little bit better in the gameplay side and a bit better on the presentation side, maybe that would shine through more often. But and I amusingly jump scared my brother because he was like lassoing some dude, and then from a mountaintop I fucking chucked it headshot cleaver. But that was pretty good. But it was, and also very slapstick. But he felt the impact anyway, and so did that NPC. He's dead. Bye. So
well, that's because there's an interaction in it, right? Yeah, you are responsible for what's going on. So that's why there's more, because now that interaction is serving as feedback for your action,
right? Yeah.
As opposed to you just pushing a button, you already know what the end result's going to be because it's an animation.
Well, yeah, I mean, so
you just push an animation and stuff happens. And look, the game told me to do this, so I may as well do it.
To that point, it's more satisfying when in Doom Eternal you use a shotgun on an enemy, and that's what decapitates them or splits their body.
Of course, it punishes you for doing it too. So it tries to do its darnest to punish you for taking initiative.
Oh yeah, and also if you're like specifically not doing these glory kills, then you're losing out on health or whatever the fuck. Like it's bad. And I do like when you can slapstick teleport around doing that too because of the fucking upgrade and all that sort of shit. But like another thing that this makes me think about is in StarCraft 2, you like it messes with readability really badly. But at some point they added physics simulation, which was obviously very silly.
They're really awful. Havoc or whatever it was implementation.
It's like Havoc without being named Havoc, or like they couldn't license Havoc, so they basically stole it, or I don't know what happened. But there are moments where it's like, oh, you hit this guy with like an explosive. There's not even a fucking Reaver in that game, but there's something like a Reaver, and then they just go flying is like, oh, that's kind of satisfying. It's like feedback that they died in that way. But it's obviously like corpses are a pretty big deal for reading like the army, what it was, what its composition was. And so you want to disable that for readability purposes, which is a bit of a letdown. But like you could imagine in a game that maybe it was like more of an FPS game, like the ragdoll physics or whatever of like hitting somebody with a rocket launcher. And if you didn't want them to split apart into chunks, you could have them like fly off. That's at least something where it's like, you think of Halo or whatever. They don't really do that in those games. Whereas like you think of other games that have rocket launchers, maybe they do have the ragdoll, or they at least like repulse the corpse or something, make it go flying instead of just falling to the ground like a sack of potatoes.
I remember in Counter-Strike Source, one thing that was always entertaining was setting the physics push scale to something inverse and really high.
Yeah.
So when you shot somebody, they came flying at you at the force of a meteorite. They just would like fly across the map. It was always physics is one of those things. It's just I'm always conflicted on because games always do it terribly.
Yeah, it's fun to play around with, but it's really like difficult to make it not slapstick.
It's very difficult to make it work well
and
actually complement the game. Pretty much every game that has physics, it's like it's either a visual only like meme or it serves to be more of a nuisance than something that complements.
CSGO got updated like a year ago ahead of one of the previous majors, and one of the changes that they made to the ragdoll physics was to make it more generous, and that led to hilarious slapstick moments where you would shoot somebody and they would shoot directly into the sky. And so this was happening like on professional broadcasts and stuff. And like just like the average result was a little bit more impactful or maybe satisfying in that visceral sense. Like if they were jumping and you headshot them, they would just like slam backward into the object that they were jumping in front of or something like that. That's kind of interesting. But obviously if it comes at these like bugs, they and everybody's just like, no, this is great, leave it in because it's funny. LOL. It's like, okay, well, maybe there's more to the game than just it being like a laughing stock every now and then. But don't worry, because there's still a bug in this game that has existed for like 5 years now, where certain skins will just not render the gun, so you'll be in third person, not for players, but for the observer and for the viewing experience. You'll be observing a player, and he'll be holding an invisible gun like a bad anime, and then he'll take a shot or die or whatever. So that's great. I'm glad that's just like in the game forever now, and it'll never be fixed. So
I'm brought back to one of my early XXEs were on VHS, and one of my sources of old recordings was GoldenEye 64, where if you put it in a slow motion and you have remote mines, and if you detonate them at just the right place, you'll make enemies just fly straight up into the air into the skybox.
Yeah, that's great. It's like the landmines in Halo 3. I used to do that to people, just send their fucking like. That's more entertaining than
physics has always just been goofy.
Yeah, it's just very silly. So yeah. Anyway, we're talking about the idea of games and how they've not really leveraged the 3D realm, the third dimension very well in the context of visuals. But I feel like it's probably a reasonable segue into talking about what they also don't do in terms of gameplay. Like there's obviously the example of stuff like StarCraft 2, where the projectiles just fly through walls or whatever the fuck, because they don't actually, it's not a third dimensional game. And also that like, there is the question of whether you even want to incorporate a third dimension into the gameplay of an RTS. I'm not really sure that it really ever works.
Supreme Commander does that, and it's a disaster.
Yeah, and Homeworld also does that, and I have not really seen any reason why you would want to play. Like Homeworld seems actually less and less of an RTS the more I look at it. I still haven't played it.
Homeworld is more like an RTT. Yeah. It's so small scale. Like the 3D in Homeworld is a meme. It really doesn't take advantage of it. It does show that it could have been interesting.
Right.
If they had made an actual game surrounding it. But Homeworld is like a really early like tech demo that then got released too late into the lifespan of games, and they forgot to actually make a game surrounding it. So it's just
Well,
like
now
a
they can
visual
endlessly
tech demo.
remaster a bunch of games over and over again and make them less
Yeah.
functional, which is apparently just how every game is going to go for now.
And then
but-
they made Homeworld 2, and they actually removed a lot of the 3D
yeah.
real everything from it. And Homeworld 2 is really honestly terrible.
So it didn't improve things.
Their new game is probably going to be a train wreck too, because anything Gearbox is anywhere near just rots and is just absolutely rancid.
Yeah, I thought THQ went out of...
THQ should be dead.
Yeah.
But they like cling to your ass hairs like those shit nuggets that no matter how much you try to grab them with your fingers, they keep like smushing out of them. That's THQ. They should be fucking gone. But it is Gearbox who owns the rights, I believe. At least in part.
Well, yeah, I was only bringing up THQ because I was pretty sure that THQ should have been dead because they went out of business a while ago and then they came back. And I think Gearbox should also get the THQ treatment, but
yeah,
not come
they
back,
should have been gone. But it is actually surprisingly hard to kill these companies.
Yeah.
They can just produce absolutely nothing but shovelware and manure for 20, 30 years, and they still won't go bankrupt because clueless shareholders keep propping them up.
So the reason I was talking about gameplay and etc. is because I want to segue into our topic of level design and how that changes in a 3D world. We did talk about worlds and how we want to explore worlds and see like good epic things and all that stuff. And obviously how all of the technical issues and the deliberate decisions to try to be her definition have made it so that it's really hard to interface with that world visually. But there's also the aspect of actually physically exploring this space, and I know that's a big sticking point for your level design, where you specifically have said before that in your title you want players to be able to see if they can reasonably reach something based on the geometry of the layout. They should be able to. There shouldn't be invisible walls and all this other stuff. So I have talked with you about level design before in the previous episode of this exact show. But since then, you've actually been working on content alongside a bunch of other stuff. So have you had any thoughts about your process as it has evolved? Has it really changed that much since the last time we spoke? Or do you have any other new thoughts or ideas that come to mind about level design in the third dimension? Anything speaking to you?
I might actually have more to say on that once I actually see you and a couple of other people go through it. But I actually have, and this is something I'll talk more about in a little bit, I actually was able to build my project into a shipping build, and I sent it to HKS, and he streamed me his run-through of it. So this is something that, to me, is going to be kind of interesting to see people go through. I mean, it's always interesting to see people go through your project. I think having video playthroughs of your software is one of the most valuable things you can have. Not that I'm building it for other people, but it kind of shows me a lot of what the thought process of those who aren't exposed to it, because no matter how straight-laced you try to play it, you're always going to be colored by the stuff you know, whereas other people don't. And of course, I gave them some guidance because I didn't want us to be sitting there for 2 hours and something I know where there's no key for this door right now, so whatever. And but it's kind of like interesting to see, just like, because I'm not having indicators that tell you where to go. I'm considering having a prompt you can do where you can pray and receive a very vague general guidance. Like an arbiter, it might direct you towards crows, and then you would later, look for the crow statues and be like, oh, so that's your objective.
Caw.
But as opposed to the average game, where it's just like, oh, go here and do this, 3 times, because 3. So, of course, with Dark Souls, Dark Souls is a very linear game, all corridors. And so you always know that the right direction to go is just forward, because you haven't gone forward. Yeah. And then if you ever divert from that path, it's a secret. So most games are not even as open as Dark Souls is, which is honestly really sad. And of course, on top of that, most games are 2D. So I've mentioned it before, and it's worth mentioning again, is that I hope to have verticality in my game, because pretty much no 3D game really has verticality. 3D games these days are just 2D. They're all masquerading. And the problem with that is that while you're not really taking advantage of 3D, you're also losing out on the opportunity to make, well, really just more depth to your content in general. Like, let's take, for example, enemies jumping over ledges. That kind of never happens in games. It's really strange. In fact, how in Doom Eternal, they do have nav links for enemies going over certain ledges, but in the extreme majority of the game, you sit on a ledge, enemies can't get to you. almost like they didn't actually think about 3D. So that's a very serious issue with, I mean, even 2D games too. Where enemies don't navigate ledges. And when you are building a level for a game in which enemies cannot even so much as navigate ledges, you kind of get funneled into making very fixed areas where you fight them. So then you start not having ledges anywhere there's enemies at because, well, the alternative is to have the player sit on a ledge and kill them like I do in just about every game I've ever LP'd.
Yep.
And that's absolutely not good at all. And then as a result, your whole level design starts to change because this one thing pulling it down is a very critical thing. If you no longer, like if you're building an action game and your action is completely restricted to 2 dimensions, now your entire game is being interacted in 2 dimensions. It doesn't matter if you're ascending levels or jumping up through jumping puzzles or some other bullshit between arenas. The vast majority of the game's content is going to be contained within those arenas. Your boss fights, for example, in the case of Dark Souls or anything like that, is going to be within the arenas. But suddenly, all those arenas had to be 2D. So all of Dark Souls is 2D. And you know, the whole thing about castles and stuff like that was walls and ramps and drawbridges and ledges and valleys and choke points and taking advantage of combat in general, not just medieval style stuff. But while you have a few walls and archers just conveniently placed on the walls, the extraordinary vast majority of the game is done through 2D, except for ladder griefing, which, funny as it is just there. It's called ladder griefing for a good reason because it's literally a meme. And the vast majority of the game is not experienced through ladder griefing anyways. But other than using the plunging attack or abusing ledges and shooting people with a bow, your interaction with ledges mostly comes as a result of you exploiting things. And the problem with just exploiting things is, well, there's a reason why it's called an exploit, because it's unintended. In a world in which 3 dimensions is treated as 3 dimensions, just never seems to cross these people from, DMC 1 actually had enemies that jump ledges. And I think some of the ones in DMC 3 might have, but most of them don't. And I don't remember much about DMC 2 besides endlessly shooting things with a rocket launcher and stunning them, so I can't comment on that. But then we went into the realm of like DMC 4 and DMC 5. The game design sharply went downhill until we reached the ultimate complete fuck, which was DMC 5, in which they just abandoned all sense of reasonability and common sense altogether at all stages in that game, where many bosses can be easily killed just by sitting in the air and attacking them, because they just seem to have forgotten that you actually have air attacks in that game completely. One of the second last boss of the game, you just sit in the air and you just attack, and the almost nothing he does can hit you in the air except for like one punch or something. And if you fall on the ground and start attacking him on the ground, suddenly you actually have to deal with lasers and stuff everywhere. But most of the boss's attacks that he uses while you're in the air are like stomps and ground lasers and stuff like that. Like, you just ignore this shit.
Yeah, the equivalent of building roaches to counter Void Rays, right?
Yeah, it's even dumber because you're not even talking about ledges and stuff anymore. You're literally talking about a game in which a basic moveset that you've been using for the vast majority of the game, the enemy has nothing to deal with it. And most of the bosses in that game are like that, where you can just sit in the air and just attack stuff. Particularly after you get Dante, you just sit in the air and just attack stuff. Most enemies just can't handle it at all. It's just ridiculous. And now when you talk about level design, if you take out the whole thing of having ledges and enemies that can navigate ledges, and you start to have the design levels around that, you just...
Well, you're taking out the 3rd dimension, right? You're taking out the Z-axis.
Exactly. Yeah. It's 2D like StarCraft 2. And, when I think about 3D, I think specifically of like Halo PC, of, UT99, UT 2004, where we had verticality in a lot of maps. And verticality was a big thing in a lot of maps. And so for me, it's always been very strange to come from that and play ARPGs where literally everything is in 2D. And everything is in 2D. Now, most of these games also use a fixed camera, which is also extremely awkward, and I think for its own discussion, and for sure. And with the fixed camera, honestly, that really doesn't absolve you of this, because ledges are so many ways you can do ledges, and enemies just don't do anything with them. when I think about level design and just the non-linearity in general, there is that thing that tickles me that I think a lot of these people, they stay away from actual true open world exploration because they're afraid of people getting lost. And yeah, I can think of so many of the old games where getting lost was kind of a part of it, but you usually had landmarks to go by to
it's part of
find
the
your way around.
exploration, right?
Yeah, one of the infamous ones that I think of is one of the GoldenEye levels. I don't know if it was a scrapyard or ruins or old what it was. It was one of the later areas where I think you kill one of the characters, and or one of the characters dies or something. I can't remember what it was. It was so many years ago, but it was a darker area. They're not really open, but it was fairly easy at the time to get lost in if you really weren't paying attention to the landmarks. But once you paid attention to the landmarks, it was really easy to navigate. I think I remember that level explicitly for having to unlock a cheat on it. Took a number of reruns on it. And then you understood that paying attention to basic landmarks is really important. Because the thing about, especially modern players, is they don't really pay attention to what's going on. That's why everything is a series of flashing lights and ceremonies and stuff yelling at you and telling you what to do. It's because people are literally incapable of thinking for themselves. And you will see this even in fairly simple games, superficially simple, where people can get very lost very easily if you've been handing them guidance and then suddenly they don't do that anymore. You break consistency by not handing somebody a piece of information. And it doesn't even need to be that sophisticated of an environment or a setup for like that. But once you derail the consistency in that matter, people can get lost really, really, really easily. And since games, again, we go back to the whole marketing thing, constant exposure, constant new content, constant new stimulation is the end thing. You got to keep constantly stimulating. You can't have any slowdowns. Stopping is bad. That's why everything has to have timers and limited restrictions and stuff on them, is because you got to do that. Because what if people have to stop and think? It's all about keeping people moving constantly. You're going to notice this in just about every game you play. Games try to just keep you moving over and over and over. And they don't want you to stop and look at stuff for a variety of reasons. But my game, I don't do that. You have to stop and think about what's going on, what's going, because no point in it is going to be an indicator that tells you where to go. Some of it's going to be kind of linear. A lot of it really isn't. And I'm honestly like that's something, again, I'll have to revisit the subject later because I'm going to be really curious about. I think that because this is a level I have shown in some of my casts, it's not going to be really clear cut. I'm kind of hoping that if November isn't insane, I can actually put another level into there with some very basic stuff just to see how people go through it. Because what I'm curious about is what people prioritize when they're nothing holds to their hands at all. Are they going to stick their hands up their pants and stuff them into their bum hole and feel around for their colon? Are they going to stick it into the front of their pants and stick it up their axe wound and feel around for Jim? What are they going to do? Where are they going to go first? Why are they going to go there? What drives them to there? And then what areas are they going to avoid? Because there is no example I have on hand for that at all. Nothing has even attempted to do things that way. The closest you get is Dark Souls, but again, Dark Souls is very linear. You just go wherever the shining loot is. It's just, eventually you find the boss door. And there's no shining loot in this, right? That stuff's going to be well hidden. The keys that you need for doors are going to be hidden. And the way I'm designing, I'm not going to have it in for this version, but the way I'm designing the save points and stuff like that is to save the state of the world and of any health statues if they are there, which means that you actually will, if you're having difficulty with a level, and I don't think you're going to have difficulty with it in this build. I think it'll be a few builds before you do, because the enemies are just not at the level right now where they have the tools necessary to really threaten you once you know what you're doing. But once they're at the level, I want you to have to be able to actually plan out the level according to your skill set, where you can take the risk and spend the extra time to get the stuff you need to set up a path where you can save at a certain point in case, you got something dangerous you're struggling with. Or you can choose to skip that stuff and just go through the whole thing without actually doing that. So there's, whether or not I have any more sophisticated world building stuff off of that, like in terms of level design, if I introduce any like kind of puzzle stuff or whatever, I honestly find designing that stuff really hard because I like it to be as cleanly integrated into the world as possible. I'm not sure I'm going to do that. That is actually one of the things I'd be looking for suggestions on. Where that could be placed would also be kind of interesting because I think like with exploration, there needs to be a drive to explore. Now, for the conventional title, that would be like experience or currency or something that obviously that doesn't exist in this. So currently, the only things that really drive that is the keys and the statues, the save points and stuff like that. Those will be hidden, and they won't just be out in your path in most of the cases. So if you want to go look for those to make your run safer, you can look for those. But that in itself, you know, I may have like some story-based like memory fragments hidden somewhere as well. We're not going to have the first vision in all likelihood in this, so most of that's not going to be present in this example demo. But in the future, you know, that might be something we hide for people who want to search for lore-related stuff. But you know, that's something I got to think about. But
well, let me hit you with this is immediately making me think of how I would relate it to 2D level design, but it's not because of the fact that there's a difference in dimension count. It's just, I think of RTS level design, I think of FPS level design, and you know, CSGO level design, it can be 3D, it can work in some verticality. There are problems with that because it's such a positionally based game that if you give away footsteps, and footsteps are like radial, so you can hear somebody below you even if there's like solid concrete or whatever in between, and that's just, they've just never decided to like alleviate that or change that, which would probably make vertical maps a little bit more functional for the professional meta. But anyway, either way, it's like there can be verticality in these games, and you know, in 2D cases, in something that's an isometric game, you can at least have height levels anyway as like part of your idea, right? So what you're talking about with like placement of things and how you're going to be, you know, maybe thinking about it. Well, let me just talk about the systems in general. So you have the health shrines and you have the save state shrines, which you showed off in the previous episode of this show, and then you also have keys which lock progression in certain areas, and I feel like you actually have the tools necessary to do a lot of really cool things with that, because you have resources, which are the shrines, and then you have progression locks, which are the keys. And so as you get, you know, you get your grasp, it's like, you know, in Brood War, you would place resources in certain areas, and then, you know, instead of keys, it would be more like choke points or something. You could try to conceptualize it as, is like, if you hold this territory, you can kind of like lock off this whole area of the map or whatever. It's like an area of power. And so that I break maps down in the idea that you've got assets and pathways, and then I also added courtyards to the idea, which was like this idea of like a big battle can be facilitated here. But like the pathways are just taking you between assets, and the assets are like either obviously resources, or it's like if you control this area, you have this like big ass build space where you can build a lot of structures, or you can like lock out this choke point or this rotation or whatever. And then maybe there's like neutral objects as well that could be quantified as assets if you ended up having any in your RTS, like you think of the Warcraft 3 shrines or the Fountains of Life or whatever. And then if you imagine trying to map that onto a third dimensional level design, and you have these resources that you do have, you can choose, do you want them to be hidden and reward exploration that way? Do you want some of them to be like guarded by enemies? And then it's like, okay, can I like correctly dispatch all these enemies without dying? And then like, you know, if I'm really good at my job here, then I can actually save that health shrine for later because I didn't even take that much damage clearing it or something. So it can be that element. Obviously, you can have like the save state shrines in similar positions because they're still a resource. Maybe they're just not immediately. They're more of a thinking man's resource, I guess you would say, is because it's like, okay, this is where I have to actually do some strategic planning when I decide to use it. But it's still valuable to have like available. So if I have to clear it or if I have to discover it or something, then that's something. But you can also pace the player's exploration using the keys, because you can lock out more complex areas or areas that are maybe more dangerous, or like, I'm imagining you're going to do stuff like this, but maybe it's not even something you've thought about, is like once you open a door using a key, maybe that unveils some threat that will then like explore the map from their location, you know? So like you could imagine there's a pack of void hounds behind this door, and they, you know, I haven't fought void hounds yet. I've only fought bears or something. And so like, that's like a reveal of a threat, or it's a, just like unleashing this force onto the broader world. And so you could work that into your planning as well. If you're a player, you could think, okay, I don't really want to take on this like challenging set of enemies in the courtyard over here, but if I can just like unlock this pathway using this door, like I can go find the key, and like, you know, you can obviously have multiple paths. You're talking about non-linearity. So I feel like you have all of the equipment necessary as a level designer and a game designer to create really compelling plots where player choice and player playstyle is going to influence how the map unfolds, plus all of the elements that might be more on the dynamic side, like, you know, enemies infighting or just monsters in general exploring the map themselves, roaming the map. Maybe they have things that they want to do that the player doesn't directly interact with, like. You could imagine there was like, a dinosaur trying to guard her eggs or something, or like a bear trying to guard her cubs. Like, they have their own objectives maybe that you could also throw into this for even more depth. But I feel like even just with what I know is going to be in the game based on what you've shown and what you've told me, you have a lot of opportunity to design really compelling levels that reward exploration, but do so like, obviously you have plans for the flashbacks and stuff, but the memory system, but it's like, from a mechanistic standpoint, players, I think, will be incentivized to explore if it's communicated to them by the game that exploring can give them access to shrines or access to keys in like an alternate route or something that's like going to mean that they take less damage or whatever. Like it will be like its own. And it's kind of weird because you don't really think about exploration as a skill set, but I feel like you could almost stress that in this, you know what I mean? As part of like your strategy for taking through the map. I don't know if that makes you think of anything, but that's sort of my initial estimation of the tool set that you have as a developer.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really the whole goal. That's the intent, is that I think it's going to rewire the way a lot of people think about levels. And it'll be a while before I have one that's complex enough to really represent that. But I'm hoping to have a little bit within our return. Again, as long as November isn't too insane, I'm going to be focusing a lot on actual content pushing at this point. Since a lot of what I was doing before up to this point was modernizing stuff and adding in systems to build content for and stuff like that.
Sure, yeah.
So, absolutely. Because I'm still really conflicted on what kind of special abilities and stuff are going to be in there. I do want to have a travel form. I don't think it's going to be in by December. And if there's going to be any secondary weapons or anything like that, even the bow is still really conflicted because it's, when you talk about the bow and the 3D pathing and stuff like that.
Oh, right.
That's a big thing to add to the game because it could open up like things you have to completely redesign everything and how you think about a lot of stuff when you start adding in ranged attacks. So I was going to make the ranged attack require you to like charge it up, kind of like the power shot in Terra, for example. Maybe anchor you, use it like artillery, maybe have several different moves or stuff like that. I was trying to think of maybe adding other kinds of mobility to the player. It's unfortunately the way I'm designing stuff right now is a lot of content's going to go in before I even get to attempting any of that stuff, and I don't know how it's uncharted territory. I don't really know what it's going to do. That if we are here for another year, I doubt if I'm able to consistently work on it, that this will even resemble what it looks like today in a year, other than some of the core concepts and the ideology behind it. But absolutely having verticality level is important because I have double jump, I have the mantling system. I doubt I'm going to add any kind of climbing. I'm even conflicted about ever adding ladders, even though they are a big thing. It's more like, well, now it's another movement system I have to account for, and I don't really necessarily need it. If I add it, maybe I'll just design the ledges in such a way where you can just jump onto them instead. I don't know yet. But the way I've designed it right now is just even as a test demo is you have stuff out in the courtyard and you can avoid it. But if you get, if you sit around in the beginning for a while, the White Hounds tend to just wander in and then you're fighting them inside this little room. And then you can actually take some damage. So it is definitely something that I've done some 3D level design before for just very basic stuff. I did mangling of Unreal maps and then building stuff in the UDK and then, of course, building the scenes for Retribution and stuff like that. And verticality is one of those things I feel it's just so unexplored. There's just so much you could do with it. And just the very process of being able to move around in the world while fighting. Just the whole concept of having an unrestricted fight where enemies don't just leash.
Yeah.
They don't get stuck. They don't run away or turn invincible when you go on a ledge or anything. Those are just shitty boilerplates. These garbage games keep pushing out because they're too lazy to make real level design. When you have something where enemies actually pursue you, then you start thinking about taking them places. And then you start thinking about how do they fight in different places. You just open up the whole natural process of actually using terrain as something else other than just, look, it's pretty. In most of these games where we have these storytelling showcase terrain, you can't even go into it because it's all linear. It's all just invisible walls. I think of Last of Us. It's literally just a single long corridor.
Yeah.
You can't go fucking anywhere.
Yeah, all the
And
doors are fake. You just like
yeah,
can't even walk into them or whatever. That really pisses me off in games because the whole idea is that you're selling this expansive world. So if you're going to put a door somewhere, I should be able to open it surely, or a window I
hmm
can climb in maybe if the game has mechanics for that. But like it's just wild to think that most of the time when you see an object in a game, even a game that's about exploration allegedly, you can't actually go into that room or investigate that object fully or whatever. And I mean, obviously, there's another layer to this, which you were just touching on, which is, if the enemies are using the terrain itself, we saw in the weed. I forget what is it.
yeah, the malicious
Malicious
weed.
weed. I knew there was an adjective there. I can't remember what it was. So the malicious weed is the scorpion-looking thing from the last demo, from the last
Yeah.
episode, and it's obviously it's got that whole projectile shtick, and then it creates this field that damages your block health and stuff, and it's like that way it's like, okay, now we have to worry about the arc of the way that the projectile works, and are they going to fire around? I don't think you've hooked that particular part up yet, because that's like more
hmm
advanced logic for like trying to estimate paths and stuff. But
Yeah.
having all of this really interesting stuff, and obviously that unit is very dependent on the terrain. Like
Yeah.
the terrain can make a huge difference for the engagement. And I mean, anything with a ranged attack. So the Void Hound, and obviously it has a teleport as well. Like that also qualifies, right? So it's like
Yeah.
there's so much that it could be interacted with. And usually there's not. Like you don't even get. It's not just that you don't get the interaction with the AI enemies in most games. You also don't even get the satisfaction of like once the combat is over, being able to go and investigate that place or whatever.
hmm
Which is it's just really weird. Like in Red Dead Redemption, which I obviously have been using as an example for a lot of different things this episode, there's like you take objects from people. If you like, you can steal from them, or you can just like, if you find an object somewhere, you can pick it up. And it's like, in a game that's like that, you'd think I would be able to break into more houses and just start stealing stuff. But no, you can only break into the developer approved houses, which is just like, why though? Like, why is that
Yeah.
why are they so stringent with it? So that really always irked me in any of these games, that you can't actually go to a place and explore a place that you can see. And so that's one of the main reasons why I'm really excited to check this out come December, because it's going to be really satisfying to be able to just climb wherever I want or whatever, depending on my ability to do so within the game's mechanics, but also depending on the environment. Like it just sounds like you were talking about rewiring people's expectations. It's like sounds like a breath of fresh air to me.
No. Yeah. Obviously, it's going to be, it's not really ready to show off, and it won't be ready to show off by December, but it should at least give a few hints of where things are going to go, given time, energy, and of course, real life willing. Arbiter is just, a very simple thing I was doing up actually just to test assets at one point, and it's just kind of grown from there, as things always do.
Right.
And I have some ideas for it. I don't know if I'm going to get around to it, but I am going to do some basic setup for that, and I was already thinking of ways I could separate keys and progression in that, and I've got a few ideas. I'll hopefully be able to get to some extent in there, at least as demonstrable ideas. There are actually things, there's a number of things I've put together that I have not demoed yet, and I'm intentionally not demoing them yet because there are some things I want to show off that I've put together. Just nothing as advanced or as feature filled as Arbiter at this point, but still something that will be new. So level design is definitely a really big one. There is another level that will be shown in there, which is more of an RP level at this point. It'll be serving as the hub, the equivalent of the Nexus in Demon Souls, where you will be able to go places and where you can talk to the Iron Emperor. And right now it's just very simple. I haven't really worked on it too much. It was actually, I was drawing out a lot of bugs on Nanite with it actually, and but it is an area I'll continue to work on as time goes on. It's a very different kind of map. It will demonstrate right away that you will be expecting very different kinds of terrain. One of the things you will be able to expect in this world is that as you go further through it and things get more crazy, the worlds and environments will get more strange and elaborate. Of course, I did show off one of the Kali domain maps, which was based on one of the D&D maps a while ago, which has a lot of flesh and dark colors in it, and that's also been worked on a little bit. I've done some more environmental stuff for it. And then the first Vision map, I believe I demoed on the server at least a little bit, which was sort of like grayscale, kind of like, I don't know how to describe it, but it's also a very different kind of environment. And
Oh, you're talking about like what looked like a bunch of gray boxes and squares and stuff. They call that the gray box
No, it's
style. Or?
it's one that's floating in fog, with the Japanese castles and stuff like that.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And that's where you it's actually going to be the intro, or at least in the current design stuff, we're going to change it. You play as young Anna, and that's actually supposed to be your tutorial map that lets you get used to the movement system, the camera, jumping, mantling, stuff like that. I'm hoping to be the travel form in that map and stuff like that, so you can be kind of introduced to the base mechanics before I instantly thrust you into fighting and the dark forest, which was being worked on as well. And so that's also a very different kind of environment as well. It's got more dead trees and stuff in it, but it's also using mushrooms for elimination. And there's going to be a river of blood. You're going to be fighting in bones, and there's stuff like that. Actually, with some work, I was actually able to make fairly reasonable looking blood for the river, which was something I really wasn't expecting to be able to do. But with some effort and a little bit of help from HKS to make a scene depth mask, it's not perfect, but workable. So absolutely thinking a lot about environments and that, because 3D navigation is just, I've played all kinds of 3D games, like World of Warcraft and Halo and, so on and so forth. And the vast majority of them just really aren't 3D, and fights don't really take place in 3D. You always think about, the third dimension. Well, I'm an audio kind of guy, and I started off with making like radio play kind of stuff. And I haven't done too much of that in digital, but audio has always, of course, been with me wherever I've done any kind of production otherwise. And immediately into working on that other map, Star Fortress Zeus, I started, and in Arbiter too, I've added audio to that, samples of audio, and I set up occlusion. I haven't been able to get reverb to work. I don't know why that is so temperamental, but occlusion's working. And just the audio skip alone is amazing how much life it adds. But of course, it's something I'm used to. The way I think about audio, and I think about the audio presentation, soundscape, is it is something that transcends dimensions. It is something that you build a world with nothing but audio. And you're no longer really thinking about 2D or 3D. You build an environment, you're playing with the imagination. And that's how something I try to kind of approach just level design in general with, is building the expectations of something beyond just 2D and 3D. You just think of it as an environment. So a lot of, at least, everybody that I know traditionally approaches these games as 2D or 3D. You just approach it from a very mechanical first perspective. Where something is 2D, you stand on a ledge, enemies can't do anything to you, or they might revert to a ranged attack. And of course, in MMOs like World of Warcraft, where they just become invincible and reset. And in some games, they just teleport to you or whatever. In this, it'll be completely rewired, because you don't get the segregation between concepts. You don't have an arena and then a dialogue or a cinematic and then another arena. At any point, in many of these cases, you can be attacked by things that are roaming. You can pull things to places. Things can chase you up to places. The whole idea is just to have that living world. And when you think about an open world, like, say, Skyrim's like a really shitty tech demo that somebody puked onto some CEO's lap, and he looked at it through his semen-encrusted eyes, glazed over with Cheeto dust, as he had a fistful and a bag of Doritos, and said, "Yeah, I guess we'll release that. It looks neat." And the guy tries to say, "No, it's not ready." "Yeah, we'll release it. It looks neat." And then before you know it, Todd Howard has released the 30th version of Skyrim, topping charts across the world, and it's still that untested prototype. But because it's an untested prototype, if you aggro something, you can kind of chase it or get it to chase you places. But most enemies and things and assets in the world only spawn when you go right up to them. The content is reactive as opposed to active. The whole idea behind the living world concept and the Starsworn concept and everything that led us up to this point was to have an actual living world that was actually active and alive, which meant that things do stuff and everything is a part of a single synthesis. And that is something that games intentionally avoid. Games are always reactive these days. And when they give you a timer, it's explicitly to force you to be reactive to the timer rather than to the game. It's an entire defeat of the whole purpose of having content, other than just a timer. It's like, perform a quick time event in this time. Do this Simon Says in this time. There is a sequence that timer is based off of. You're supposed to perform that sequence. Whereas I want things to be more about thinking and stuff like that. And that's one of the things that kind of got me about when I was watching HKS go through it, is and then of course in my test, but this sort of reinforced it, is this will be longer than I expected to play through. When I initially was going into this, I was thinking maybe 5-10 minutes per zone. But as I started building the zones and then building the content in the zones and then making the enemies more mobile and stuff like that, I realized more and more and more we were more approaching something like the Dark Souls kind of world where it will take a while to actually navigate and move through. So then I started thinking I have to build more objective depth into the maps because you're going to be spending more time in each individual map. So each individual map has to be a bit more dense in what the actual content is. That's when I started thinking about stuff like save points, because I wasn't going to have any of those initially. My initial concept was no save points on the start of the zone and start of boss fights, nothing in between. But as we started actually getting into it, and this is how my content goes, it evolves, is I may have an initial idea, but when I vet the ideas, when I put them to the test, they evolve. I don't take really any other opinion on this. It's always what I see, what I test, what I vet. I might consider other things and as a basis and put it into an argument, but it's ultimately, I reinvent the wheel for a very specific reason, which is to know every aspect of the wheel. And then as I go through the level design, it's like, yes, I want to make this more technical, which means it's probably going to be a little more slower pace than mowing through stuff and just going from point A to point B, because point A to point B is really boring anyways. So they will probably continue to evolve from this point. You might see some more elaborate stuff show up in the future, but level design is absolutely something that I'll have to revisit, because it's one of those things where it's like, I don't even really know what to tell you what's going to happen, because it's just something that hasn't been done before. It hasn't been, only in competitive shooters really has level design been attempted in 3D, and in 2D really only like Brood War. Level design really is just like, I mean, you can see in some stuff like Castlevania and maybe Metroid and stuff like that to some extent in like Doom. But, those to me are different products, because they're from a very, like, for many of them, it's a very early, unevolved mindset with people who have very young development lives. Now, Castlevania, that's not the case because it's had so many installations. But in a lot of Castlevania, I feel like a lot of the times they're afraid to innovate, afraid to evolve. And that's most certainly the case with 3D, is people are afraid to evolve past the 2D mindset. It's why we've still got shit like StarCraft 2 that doesn't even have 2 or 3D pathing in it. You don't have real air units. You don't have real stuff. Again, Supreme Commander is the first time that anyone really tried to approach that, and it was an absolute train wreck because they didn't actually try to do anything with it. You just had slight elevations in their height map, making half of your defenses useless because they kept shooting the fucking ground, and amongst other things. And, like, it's just so unexplored, which means I don't actually really know what's going to happen when I really start exploring it. Because the more I go through, like, the jumping and stuff like that, it's like, I'm going to design collision in specific ways. I'm really care about how to do collision. And then I want multiple points of access. And AI has to navigate this. And I have issues with the fucking nav links. And then I start thinking about projectiles and stuff like that. And start thinking, okay, well, what kind of projectiles and stuff our enemy is going to have? Now I have this arcane ballistic systems that we've implemented. I haven't actually put that into the AI yet. But once I have it working the way I want, the AI, once it's aware of you, is going to be able to check to see if it can fire over certain walls and hit you behind areas it can't actually see. And once we start getting into that territory, then we start exploring, like games don't really do this. They haven't really done this. There's like case examples here and there, but games really aren't built in a world where this kind of interaction really happens, which means you don't really know how that's going to happen. That's going to open up entirely new kinds of interaction concepts you haven't even fathomed because you have no precedent to go by. It's completely uncharted territory. And that could be very interesting so long as you can get it to actually work consistently, which unfortunately the AI system is ancient, archaic, undeveloped, neglected, and there really isn't any other better solutions out there. So who knows how far we can really take it in terms of reliability. But even as a baseline, what we have existing already, just by the way the things behave, we're already treating it uncharted territory with level design. And just, it is something that I prefer to demonstrate rather than talk about, because I have such a hard time putting into words what it is I really want to do with it. It'll be easier just to show with it. But absolutely, a lot of the things you said, different elements in the world, there will be, enemies that are hostile to each other and stuff like that. And, it's called the living world concept for a very good reason. And I hope that one day I can show some of those things.
The other thing that this all makes me think about is when you were saying you don't know what's going to happen when this whole thing starts to really unfurl, when you really get deep into the weeds, do you have an idea about when a level is going to be considered done or good enough or whatever that would mean? Like, when would you say, like, say Arbiter, for example, is like the level, the grassy level that people may remember that has like the crow statues where you destroyed 3 crows and then that changed the lighting and stuff.
Yeah.
So like that was the weather and whatnot. So if people remember that from the previous episode, that level is like, it's fairly large from what I saw. I don't know if it's been significantly altered since the last demo, but
no, not really.
Yeah, and so like, are you going to be in a situation where you almost like, as you yourself as a designer explore the ramifications of this philosophy, you just like leave the early levels in the game as this idea of like, here's like you're seeing my exploration of it, but you're also exploring the same concept. Like, is that part of it, or are you going to like? Do you think that you'll eventually go back and do another pass, or maybe just replace levels outright? Like, do you have much of a thought on like when a level is going to be considered done for you, or is that also yet to be determined based on how the system evolves?
I think it's going to be very variable depending on what abilities the player unlocks and, more importantly, how I'm actually going to do progression, because I haven't decided if we're going to have linear zone unlocks or if you're always going to be able to go to a set of zones. I might have zone tiers where after you unlock a core thing from one of the zones, it unlocks the next tiers and you can go to those as well. I'm not sure yet. That's something that will probably not really be explored until I really get into a lot of stuff. But as far as when a zone's complete, I feel like it'll reach the stage where, I feel like that you have relevant content within all portions of a map. And once a map appropriately represents its visual concept. So there will certainly be maps that are larger and longer than others, for sure. And in such cases, that could factor into the tier system where late game content should probably be longer and more difficult. And early game content should probably be shorter and more concise, but and that way we can tune the difficulty in different ways. Like maybe the bosses will be more easily accessible, but longer fights or something. Who knows? Mm-hmm. But I have Arbiter is actually a very recent map where I started working on that just to stream it. Really, it was just an excuse just to start something new and then stream it a little bit. Before it became obvious that the performance was going to be more and more of an issue, and my schedules didn't really line up with anybody else's on top of it. But I've been using that for my core gameplay testing ever since I built it. And before then, I had Rangaro, which I will one day return to because it will be used. And then the Melgird map, which was, again, another map based off of a D&D map using retooled Bless assets. And there will probably be a time I return to that map and put it into the test builds so that players can see it and go through it. But there are no objectives built in that map. It'll probably remain that way. In other words, I probably will not revise it because it was a test map. And its layouts would need a lot of work in it to really make it function well with anything, really. But I think it's worth looking at just to see the concepts of taking these Unreal 3 assets and then modernizing them. And it looks pretty reasonable in Lumen. So, but actual relevant maps I intend to put into the system like Arbiter, they will be revisited time and time again. My development process is very run and gun. I tend to just focus on stuff at the moment because scheduling and everything like that doesn't work for me in any stretch of the imagination for innumerable reasons. And it's best for me just to work on Flights of Fancy anyways. But in a lot of things, I do a lot of revision passes. So the Voidhound's gone through its first revision pass in which I gave it its own particles and fooled around with the behavior a little bit. And now it's actually undergoing its second revision pass, which I'll talk about in a bit, which is porting it over to the master blueprint from mobs and bringing all the behavior, because it was separated from that because it was the first thing I made. And, we're kind of like doing a change of the guard right now where I'm trying to shed a lot of dead weight and sort of like manure from the old versions of the project from 2 or 3 years ago when it was first being built. We're trying to make systems more scalable and put all of our old content onto those systems and otherwise modernizing it. So, and then, the next revision, third revision, because 3, for example, that might see me try to implement new abilities into it. So I tend to continually iterate stuff over and over and over and over and over and over until I reach that gut stage where I feel like this is good. This is ready. And being a person who has both a perfectionist complex and extremely limited skill sets, that makes for a lot of conflict. Like with the player character, for example, I'll probably never be happy with that. And I've made some changes to it from here now, which are like fixes and polishes and stuff like that. But I'll never truly be happy with it because it's a port, and I don't have a modernized asset for it. And I have modernized assets I hypothetically could retool to be used for it, but I can't possibly modify them for that. And, we go back and forth in this, and I probably spend like 10 hours every couple days looking through the internet for possible stuff I can try to hack onto this, and there's nothing out there. And, that's something that will always bother me, start to finish, always. And that's just all because I'm not an artist. And of course, because I don't have the money to hire an artist to either. So, that's just going to keep bothering me, and there's no way out of it. There's absolutely no way out of it. And then there's innumerable things inside the project that bother me, and I have actually a series of text documents. I'm outlining a lot of stuff in which I don't want feedback on, or I do want feedback on. And a lot of the things I want feedback on is to help me fight indecision, because there's a lot of stuff I'm not confident I can do yet, or a lot of stuff I'm not sure what I should do yet, or whatever. Like there's just this raging storm about things. And through that process comes revision, where if I see something I don't like, I will eventually come back and change it. So in Retribution, that was purely visual. You would see particle effects, see up to 13, 14, 15 revisions. Those things I sent you, those sheets, the animations, many of those had gone through iterations that lasted 1.5 years, 2 years, even up to 3 years, all the way from when the project was started in Salvation. I would return to them, and if I would see a little minor room for improvement. This is why constantly testing your own software, why constantly re-exposing yourself to it, and then why having a way to distance yourself from something and then reapproach it later, a ping-pong kind of development mindset that I mentioned. I talked this a little bit about, I believe, in that interview that we did a while ago.
Yep.
Where I will build something to the most of my ability, and then I will sit on it, and I'll print the content. Like very recently, I did the first revision for the swing effect for the player's weapon, where I deprecated the old billboard that we had, and I switched onto an actual mesh. So that's first implementation is in. And I'll sit on that for a while and keep using it and keep exposing myself to it, and then busying myself with other stuff, this other technical stuff. Eventually I come back, like I have once already, and I'll just little timings on it, and I'll think, I feel like I could improve it this way. And I get myself into somewhere I feel comfortable, and then I pivot to something else, and then I wait until I find something I can change. I make it more comfortable, fit more, look higher quality, feel better to play, sound better. I'll come back and I'll work on it again. And I will just keep doing that until it reaches a point where a tremendous amount of time has passed. I don't feel like I can improve it anymore. The key thing is to not sink your time so much into something that it burns you out. Like Blender is really bad for that. Anytime I get into Blender, it is just swearing nonstop and raging and throwing things and pissing all over myself and screeching. Because Blender is just, there is nothing enjoyable about that software whatsoever. And yet I keep having to return to it because I keep having to try to fix stuff. Adjusting the hair, adjusting the model, trying to fix stuff, whatever, And so I tried to limit my exposure to that to just, I got an objective. Like I got to try to adjust the front of the hair so it wasn't as fucked up, fix the weight a little bit, and then maybe add a few more blades of hair here and there. So I go in and I do that. The toe got fucked up for some reason because of mirror corrupting the data, basically, when I was trying to fix the head a little bit in a last revision. So now my NAS model in Blender, its model is like 10-2. That means the most major versions, there's 10 major versions of that model, 10 different eras of work on it. And each of those could have 4, 5, 6, sometimes up to 10 of their own sub-revisions where I saved major points in progress in case I needed to roll back, which did happen a few times, especially when I was messing a lot with proportions and the hair. And, I would just set down something and come back after a while. And the maps are going to be like that because the maps are a tremendous composite where I could make changes to creatures, and I feel like I need to make changes to the map as a result.
Sure, yeah.
And, that's just like one example where that could see sweeping changes across something. Like, let's say, for example, I change it so that they can set the grass on fire. And maybe I want that to be able to damage the player. Maybe it'll be a transformative damage where it'll deal only stagger damage and then health, kind of like the gas cloud. Now, I feel like I should probably have grass in more parts of the map, so this can be something that's more present as opposed to just one part of the map. Or now I need to have a creature that can actually set the grass on fire in certain points. So it's like one interaction we could consider, if I ever devise such a system. I know it's possible, I just don't know how to do it. That's something that could mandate additions to a map. Now you think about, how do you work this into a map if a map is already established? So maybe you think maybe you're not going to bother with it in this map at all. But maybe you think there's other ways you can do things, or maybe other ways you can improve something. So I am very much a done when it's done kind of thing. Not Blizzard. I don't follow an internal thing and just spout things. It's more like, I know this project will never actually finish, not only because I'm not going to live long enough to finish, but also because my idea of finish is a complete experience. And that's a lot of time. Like, Armageddon Onslaught was kind of like that too. But more looking towards my other longer running projects like Retribution and Lowlands of Legend 2042 and even D&D to an extent, is that constantly revisiting stuff and improving it. It's just integrally built into it. And there will certainly have to be a cutoff to that as the project grows, because you'll reach a point of diminishing returns. And that's the point where you have to accept that work in some spot is not going to give you as much return as work into another spot. And I do struggle a little bit with time management in that regards. But again, a bridge that we'll cross when we get there. But it is certainly going to be I'll just know. I'll just feel it. I'll just feel that this is ready to go.
Well, speaking of ready to go, I think it's time to go to our last topic here, which is a sort of roundup almost of like the things that you've been
like
doing.
Like a red pill roundup.
Almost like a red pill roundup. You're right. Which is, if people don't know the name of Mesk's monthly, I suppose, series of videos that just chronicles the updates and progress on the game. So you can check that out if you're a privileged enough user in the Discord server, or if you're in his server. But if you're in his server, then you already know about that. So I did want to ask about, I saw this pretty big list of accomplishments, of tasks. So what is the current state of the project relative to the December goal? And, like one of the things you mentioned earlier was that you want to focus a lot on making actual content. What is the state of like the bestiary, the monsters and whatnot, the enemies that you're fighting, and what is your next couple specific tasks that you're going to be working on?
Okay, so, as an example, let me just whip out my folder right now, which is going to be here. So, like I mentioned, I had a few I think I probably did mention a few major things I wanted to do before December. Obviously, with the way that October went, we lost a lot of precious time, and that means I have to cut. And I'm cutting all the First Vision stuff. And that's pretty much all exclusively stuff you haven't seen, but it was stuff that was a lot of time. I'll just have to work on it some other time, because I feel like, allocation of resources, I feel like I can make better with the time I've got. But I actually have a patch notes document here, because I've actually sent HKS 2 files. The other one he hasn't played through yet. It's going to be quite different by the time he gets to it, too. I'll actually include these patch notes with the release, just so that people can see the general an absolutely autistic workflow that thing took from whatever point this was taken, even though it's not exhaustive. I actually still have my to-do documents as well, but there's just a change list. This is a version I sent HKS probably about 5-6 days ago. Here it is. No, never mind. I didn't log the exact day, but I worked on the character's hair, which was a whole bunch of things. I used different material for the hair. I put on the actual texture for it, so I added in detail normal and AO and roughness. I don't know if they actually work. Did some changes to the physics. Did changes to the character's physics. Corrected a bunch of curve nodes that were fucked and wrong. And we along this way, we've also implemented menus. So one of the main objectives I wanted to have ready for the December release that is now ready is the ability to change the graphics options. So this project is, I talked about this in the last demo, and I'll mention again, this project is using experimental shit that's very non-performant. Now, you're running on better hardware than I am, and I was very surprised that when I made the shipping builds, which was another thing I had to get done, was make sure this could actually build into a shipping build, which it does, is that it does absolutely run a lot better than the editor does. The editor has a lot of stalls for me, and I'm not really sure why. I think it has to do with the derived data cache or something like that. The ship build has nothing like that at all, and it runs substantially smoother. But I needed to have a way in case, for whatever reason, people wanted to change the settings. Maybe they didn't like the ghosting in Lumen, which looks pretty bad, or the noise and the reflections, whatever. You can turn this stuff off. You can adjust other settings. That is in. And then I needed to have it accessible through the in-game. That is also in. I also needed a way for you to be able to exit the game without using Alt F4. That is also in. So that was spread across the last couple months, actually, with the in-game menu going in just a couple days ago. So this is more of a big deal than you might imagine, because actually building a menu system in Unreal is not too different than what you would from a game from scratch. The scalability settings are what are exposed at the moment, which are normally in the engine, but you don't normally have a way to access those as somebody who just runs a shipped client. You actually have to build a menu for that. So I basically am taking advantage of the stuff that HKS built for the D&D clients, and we had to do some extra stuff on top of it to support things like Lumen, which is not exposed to scalability normally. And then also there is an audio menu as well, but I will mention this now, and we'll probably mention in the documentation that not any more than a handful of the audio is actually wired to this in the same way, because they're all using a generic music class or a generic sound class. And the menu for audio now separates that into master, generic sound effects, environment, voice, music. And then there will be one separate one for reads as well, because read sounds will have their own specific audio channel. I have the framework for that plugged in the source code, but not actually plugged into the menu yet. And of course, audio needs to be designed to actually take advantage of that. But getting all that stuff exposed to the player was a core thing. It is in. So that's a really major thing to get off the bat. The other thing, of course, is having a way to manage music. Now, since I'm using copyrighted music, you're probably going to run into issues if you put VODs on YouTube with this. But maybe not. But anyways, that doesn't really affect me. I'm going to use music regardless. But I needed a way to actually manage the music. Now, most people in most games, they just have a basic trigger that just says play this music here. We're talking about a large open world that's driven a lot through ambient sound. And the soundscape for it's very important. But also the way I wanted to do music was more like how I did in StarCraft 2, where I had separations for times in zones. So you had an intro track, and then say like phase 1, where the build early game phase. Then we had a mid game phase 2, and maybe something happens. Have like a phase 2 alternate because it went to nighttime and something happened or whatever. And a phase 3 because 3, where the mothership spawns and starts inseminating people, and I had to have your boss battle music that also follows its own series of tracks with its own logic. Now, I wanted a modern representation of this with its own configurations I could call or do as I wish in each level, where some levels may have ambient music that only plays every so often, or only during certain periods, or only in certain locations. I had to build the system from scratch, so that led to the creation of the AXX Music Master. So this is an already very powerful music system I have created that allows you to set up volumes for specific phases of music that only plays when you're within certain locations. All sorts of triggering and configurable stuff. I took advantage of other work HKS did for the music player for the D&D client that supports crossfading between tracks, which is not as simple as it sounds. So that is also configured, and that's a sister blueprint that's plugged into this, and this exposes a bunch of features through that system. So that also was built and has been continually worked on since. I might have mentioned its initial implementations in the last demo, but it is actually, I'm hoping, I have it hooked up in the menu and in Fortress Zeus. I don't have it hooked up in Arbiter yet, because I don't actually have enough music in Arbiter to warrant its use yet, but it is something that will be used throughout the project. So that's these. when I mentioned before that what we're doing is mostly internal system stuff, it's kind of non-flashy stuff, but it's stuff that is super integral to the game.
Absolutely.
The music system is one, menus are another. You don't really maybe think of those as being really core things you're going to work on when you start building your game, but they are because you need them to actually build off of. And that's really major. So my notes is filled with a ton of random stuff about this, the menus and the stuff like that. And, again, a lot of under the hood stuff that I did in the last while, which was setting up the master blueprint for mobs, putting the Void Hound onto that. When I did that, I started getting validation warnings all over the place that the Void Hound was tripping because the stuff I was doing, the weed wasn't tripping, and I was very confused by that. So, that just helps me just start tidying up stuff. So I run a very tight ship in that when I see major bugs, I try to fix them if I can on the spot. There are certainly some major bugs right now. Right now, the bug I'm having is I want the Void Hounds to teleport between the jump points. And for some reason, the teleportation will fail on certain jump points because it thinks it can't fit. And I'm not sure why that's happening, but I needed a fallback for that. So what I'm doing right now is a fallback. I set up a fallback for that where it casted a nav mesh and looks for a larger nav mesh and then a random point within that place on that nav mesh. And I'm going to have a second fallback where if it fails to do that, then it'll try to do the jump instead. So there's not all the framework that's just, it can be really tedious and annoying, and it's sort of invisible, but it's a way of making sure things, you don't want units to get stuck on jump points. So this is something you got to do. And Arbiter, for example, the other thing I need to do with Arbiter absolutely before we reach December is I need to continue building nav links on it. That takes a very long time. I spent an entire day building nav links and that set up just for where the first crow statue was, and then some of the other beginning area, and it's still not finished yet. And that's just because nav links are so fucking temperamental where they just don't want to link up properly. It is really buggy, really annoying to use. It's definitely one of the weakest parts of all of Unreal Engine is the AI system, the nav links, and everything related. The recast system is so garbage. I hate it. And I have to, I don't know. I think I'm going to have to figure out other ways to do navigation, jumping, and stuff like that because the nav links are just ceaselessly frustrating and annoying to deal with and really time consuming. But before December, I've got to hook that up because there's a lot of areas in the level they will not jump to right now. So the other thing I got to do is I had a step list of stuff I wanted to do. I wanted the dialogue system to be functional. I wanted Zeus to be functional. I wanted the first vision to be functional. The first vision is now scrapped. I still want the dialogue to be functional. That's all in. So you can start the game, go into Zeus, teleport to Arbiter, and I want Arbiter to have a something you do to complete it. I don't know what. Initially, that was going to be killing an example boss, but I don't think we're going to get to that point. The bestiary really has not evolved too much since then because I've been doing a lot of systems updates and testing and stuff like that. But I have been trying to work on that, and I have stuff I can put in once they're actually finished. There's another weed type that I'm working on that I've been setting up the framework for and trying to research how to do some different things with, and the results I'm finding are annoying, but I might be able to make them work. But there is something else. I was talking about the IK retargeter in the demonstration.
Yep.
And how I hadn't really got into it that much, but the results were kind of mixed. So, Epic released a video, the analyzing Lyra animations video, where they talked about their Lyra content demo, which was the replacement for the shooter demo. And they were talking about the IK retargeting system and other stuff within it. And it is the closest thing you can get to really being able to learn the developer's point of view on the retargeting system. And the results are very much the same as everything I had stated in the last video. The IK retargeter cannot handle arm lengths that are shorter than the source. It causes problems. And clavicle lengths that are shorter. So all those issues I've had with retargeting, that is still very much an issue with the IK retargeter. And Epic recommends you to have your animator fix the animations or tune your in-game content to the assets. In other words, they're basically expecting that you're just a multi-million developer that has animators on staff and can just redo all this shit. It really brings into question why you have the IK retargeting to begin with if you can't use it for this shit. Extensive research throughout the internet and everything related kind of just reinforces this, that nobody has really actually found a solution to this. But I did discover that if the limbs are longer, you can get much more functional results. So that means that there are actually assets I can use for monsters that I have access to that I can use to create creatures with that I was trying to get to work back in Unreal 4 and they would not work. So a couple of days, I think it was yesterday actually, I tooled that out and got it working, and today I was kind of perfecting that. And that means I can start work actually on an entirely new faction. And these demon characters, there will be an Armageddon faction within this, kind of similar to one from Armageddon Onslaught, at least similarly themed. But I already have a whole bunch of ideas I want to do with these. Whether or not I'll have them in with December, I don't know. But the whatever happens in Phase 2 of Arbiter, at least for demonstrational purposes, may involve these. So these are something I may work on behind the scenes and spring on people, because there's a few things I want to do with them that could be quite interesting, more environmental kinds of effects. So that was a good development. So I figured out some things through the some information that leaked out from people playing around with the IK retargeting system in my own experiments. Longer arms, there is still deformation and some other issues, and I don't know about two-handed animations that really have the most sync-related stuff. But this was a mage animation set that I had, and it worked out quite well. So I'm going to hook all that up and try to get some actual work done on creatures for this. So my main objectives for December is to have at least one, preferably more, new creatures to fight, set up a couple extra keys in Arbiter, and then have some actual conclusions in the map. There's portions in the map I wanted to flesh out. I wanted to have a harbor. I wanted to have the third tower, which we were going to fight the boss in, but the boss stuff probably won't be done by then. But at least I want you to be able to go there. Maybe the objective will be as simple as just go there, right?
Okay.
So, just something really simple. I'm imagining the playtime for the demo, if you can go through it fairly quickly, it'll probably be around half an hour. Not really that long, but I think it'll be longer in practice because people, won't know the layout. And when I add other stuff to it, if I add the creatures I want to add, they could actually be a little dangerous. So maybe it'll be a little bit more challenging in that respect. The main thing I noticed when I was watching HKS going through it is he didn't know the inputs. I told him some of the inputs, but he really didn't use them. He knew you could cancel projectiles, but he didn't really try to do it.
Okay.
And he only died midway through because he was trying to get the Voidhounds to use their ballistic attack, and they were refusing to do it. And later on, for some reason, the Templar had no damage collision. You couldn't damage them, and I have no idea how the hell that happened in the shipped build. But it means I'm going to have to test anything I make to make sure these bugs don't show up, because I don't know why they showed up. It was something that was fucked up in mine or not, but it wasn't fucked up on my
on your editor test
stuff
or whatever, yeah.
So it was really strange, and I don't know. I don't think it still does it now. But something was wrong, and I don't know why, and I don't know if it's something I did or if it was an actual bug with the shipping build. So, so that's really like I'm trying to keep my expectations low. So for me, I have already a lot of the really core major stuff I wanted in. The last month was a lot of systems work because I didn't have the time, energy, or the really motivation at all to work on anything major. And of course, we're having lots of issues with the retargeting and stuff like that all along the way. But what I did get done was still really important, like getting the test examples in for the dialogue system, setting up the menus, getting started on setting up the master blueprint for mobs and stuff like that. And, the revision for the swing effect was long awaited to get into an actual mesh for that, because that's something that once I figure out how that works, because I basically ripped apart a third-party asset down to its bones and started building back up again to figure out everything that he was doing to how to make it work. This is typically how I teach myself stuff, is I'm really not good at reading documentation or watching videos. It's really hard for me to follow those. If it's something that I at least have partial familiarity with, I can learn a lot by just disassembling it. And that's what I was doing with the particle effects. So it was one of the rare cases where the assets they gave us for free really turned out to really help me learn stuff on my own. And even just dismantling it and rebuilding it, I was able to. I still want to go back and do a lot of work to it, but just understanding the fundamentals. Unfortunately, that was a while ago, and now I forgot all that. I'm gonna relearn it, but we have our framework anyway, so it proves we can do it. And it's just like there was a lot I wanted to show off in December. I'm not going to be able to, and that's just all because real life is absolutely insane. But I'm still hard set on having that demo out. I think it'll probably be in the later half of December that I have something. Even if November turns out to be well, like I said, I try to make sure things are relatively polished. There's a lot of stuff that's not going to be in. I don't think we're going to have even basic stuff in for a lot of things, like the swing effects for the Ragnarok attacks. That's something I don't think is going to be even attempted for a while, even though it's fairly simple. But it kind of really depends on what the landlord does next. If he decides to fuck us over, then all bets are off. I don't know if we'll even have a demo ever. So, yeah, really crossing our fingers there. But the goals for December are polish up what we've shown and demoed so far, add in some new stuff to try to catch you off guard, and have at least some semblance of something that presents what an intent is.
Well, I did talk with you in the interview we did on the No Frauds Club YouTube channel about like what does it mean to be content with this project? What makes a content Mesk? And you had something kind of similar along these lines to say. It was that if you can like represent your intention, if you can ideally deliver fully upon it, but like you said, like a complete experience is most likely not going to happen. It seems impossible. But still getting like, you know, enough of the way there that the player can visualize, you know, what might have been, and also actually have an experience in the middle of the product that you are able to deliver. So it sounds really exciting, even like the little shit, because obviously I'm into game dev now as opposed to just modding. So I do know how exciting it is to get a main menu operational. I do know like, oh, there's actually like work that goes into that. Yeah, that's like, you know, the average player, like you said, is probably just going to be like, well, that's not very flashy, but you don't need to have sizzle on the steak for me to know that there was some actual effort put into that, or like that's a milestone of some sort that you should definitely be like feeling pretty good about it getting done. So that's cool. And then obviously, like you said, getting the demo out, even if it's only 30 minutes or whatever. I mean, I fancy myself like a fairly mechanical player, or like somebody who can like learn animation timings and stuff. Back when League of Legends had gameplay, that was something that I remember doing is, you know, learning animation cancels and really like getting to a high level based on that. So, you know, if it's possible to do that, and obviously like your demo demonstrated that you can do stuff like canceling projectiles and stuff, I'm definitely going to be spending a long time trying to fuck around with that. So I am looking forward to playing around with it whenever the time comes.
One of the other things I'm hoping I can get in is if that plugin goes on sale and Black Friday, I'm going to grab that. I'm hoping to implement that because that'll be having a trace-based collision versus an overlap-based collision will go a long ways to helping the accuracy, especially in low frame rate situations.
Right.
I'm hoping we can have something like that in by December, but I do not know what kind of workload implementing something like that's going to be. I don't think it'll be a lot, but in the context of everything else going on, a little is a lot. So, but that is another like really big thing on my list is I want that to be in because having accurate collision is super important for everything in this. So, yeah, there's a few other little things, but we definitely knocked off some really major ones in the last month. So I honestly, like as it is right now, I sent HKS a playable version of this because I was comfortable doing that because we had a framework that was at the stage where it's like, yeah, I'm okay having at least one person look at it. So.
And it was instructive, like you said, to see what, you know, not just like the bugs or whatever that showed up, but it was also like, oh, I get to see somebody else working on this or playing through this or whatever.
I get to see how other people interact with the content, and you, because he's not a person who really like the only kinds of games he played that are similar to this. He played like DMC like fucking years ago, okay. And he played DMC 4 years ago, and then he's played like Honkai Impact and Genshin Impact. So I have, let's see, I have you, I have him, I have a drunken Swedishman, and then I have Schwa, and then maybe Roller Skates. So those are the people I'm going to be sending it to. And across those people, I have a really wide breadth of experience with these, where you have the Swedishman, who's probably in like the top 5, top 10 DMC3 players now. And then you have like, I think Schwa's played a lot of casual games that are like this. And then we have you, who's played a little bit, and then HKS, who's played just a little bit, and then Lower Skates, who I don't think really has played hardly any at all. So I've really like kind of like spread experiences, expectations, skill levels, and sort of approaches to this. So,
well, don't you think that's actually awesome though? I mean,
yeah, it is.
Yeah, it's like you get a huge,
really what I want, because I'm not expecting any of you to have actual difficulties with this. It'll be really like, I even have a note in my documentation that says, if you find anything in this difficult, I want to know, I want to see it.
Yeah.
So,
you're going to look for streams and recordings for all this shit, for sure.
Because it's definitely not difficult right now at all. But, you know, like, I'm not really aiming for that at the moment, because it's just the way, like, the Voidhounds don't have root motion in their attacks, nor do the Weeds. Once we start throwing in enemies that have root motion, like when I get these other characters I'm talking about in now that I know can I actually retarget some of the animations I have onto them, I start building that faction. I think those are the ones that are going to start to prove that to be really difficult, because with the Voidhound, you can just kind of backpedal him forever. So he needs like some way to actually really get into you and force you to react, as opposed to you just, you know, abusing that. And then, of course, the way that I'm going to change the stats, like how easy it is to stagger them and stuff like that, is I have a way I approach stuff, but I think other people sort of develop their own different ways. Like with HKS, the main thing that he mentioned to me in his playthrough was that he felt like there should have been something you could do when you try to attack and try to attack you and you go past each other. He didn't realize that the dash was directional, because none of these games have directional dash.
Yeah.
So that like completely changed everything when he realized that. So like this learning experience is going to be very interesting to see, especially since I'm not going to have a real tutorialization to this. I'm hoping I can have the documents tell you what the different stuff does, but I'm hoping I can have an in-game way just to have a reference for it. But I think the documents should be well enough for now. But eventually, I was hoping that, I don't know. See, like there's a lot of like, I think the way Dark Souls did tutorialization was all right. But that's because Dark Souls movesets were so simple. You just had light and heavy attack and block, and that was it. So you didn't really need any tutorialization.
I mean, you were just getting tooltips, basically, which isn't great.
Yeah.
So.
Whereas in this game, I'm not going to have tooltips or pop-ups.
Right.
There will be toasts instead. So anything, like you pick up a key, or if you unlock an ability, there'll just be a toast in like the bottom left, kind of like a combat log briefly or whatever. There will be no like pop-up pausing the game or anything like that. So there's going to be like the way the information will be distributed in this is going to be completely different than most of these. Mm-hmm. And especially for this initial test, it's going to be really rough. I know a Swedishman is telling me that my hotkey scheme is really different from anything he uses. And this is completely based on my own hotkey schemes. So that will be different, at least for him. So, but otherwise, yeah, I'm hoping that just life could cool off, at least for fucking once this year, this decade. We can really get some stuff done again.
Yeah.
And just like hammer out some shit that you can fight and tune a few things, and then get some other content in and polish the levels up and just have an experience. And there's certainly like there's so many different things I could talk about in regards to that, but it's just hard for me to put in the words. Is that when I build these, and I was thinking about the length of the levels, because initially I was kind of conscious about having long levels. And I started to realize, well, it doesn't really matter. Like, how many times did I play Age of Wonders 2 with my total conversion for that, Lowlands Legends? You spend, like, fucking, like, 10 hours in the game. And, like, hardly any point of the game has passed because it travels so long. And that really didn't bother you at all. Like, it didn't bother me to have long games and stuff like Heroes of Magic 3 or whatever. It's just so long as there's actually, like, content there to explore. It's, like, genuine, authentic, and, like, changes. It isn't really super repetitive. We've already defeated the first part by having an open world that stuff moves around in. So there's certainly a harmony to be found there, but it just like feels like to me that the game concept has already evolved so much from when I first started conceptualizing and start building it, just the internal ways of which I view it, and that depending on how these demos go, if they go well, they very well could cause it to evolve even further. We might see more other such growth of the concepts just even without any commentary, just me watching how people go through it. Because I think that'll give me ideas. Because with a stark, like the thing about my development is I don't like releasing content. I don't like handing people something that isn't finished. Mm-hmm. I'm very much a do not release, and I always recommend never release betas, never release incomplete stuff, never post something that is not completely finished. I have abided by that for a long time. Release for my StarCraft stuff came very rarely and only after tons of work. And here I am spinning on that head, and we're releasing something that this isn't even a prototype. You can't even call it pre-conceptual with this, especially since I'm not even showing the bulk of the actual content in this. This is just going to show Arbiter, Zeus, maybe one or two other things if I can get them in by then. But there's all the other content I'm not showing. I'm not showing First Vision. I'm not showing Melgard. I'm not showing Rengaro. I'm not showing the other stuff that's in like earlier stages. I'm not showing a lot of these concepts. A lot of stuff that did get made is being thrown out. This is really not really to be shown. We're showing it because we kind of need to, otherwise we might not get a chance to. But also at the same time, it's a completely different way of approaching that. And, you know, it goes against a lot of what I believe. But I feel like, you know, as long as I can intake information from a measured point, that it could be beneficial. But I'm not looking to continually release demos. Like, that will, of course, depend on if I made tremendous progress in 2 or 3 months. You might see another demo. But...
well, these are like snapshots of where things are in the moment. Yeah. So they could be useful, even if like you don't release them, but you archive like builds of it or whatever that you can go back and boot up. It might be useful for you to reflect on or whatever. So it could still be a resource, but I understand not wanting to hand it out to people if it's just like an incremental progress, maybe.
Is a difference because now I have more developer-oriented people to point it towards. Mm-hmm. I have you, even though you're working on completely unrelated stuff and you don't know any of the internals of this. And then I have HKS, who does know all the internals of this and knows more about programming than I do, you know. And then I have a couple of others who aren't involved in the development but understand to some extent.
Yeah, like have a developer's mindset at least as far as it pertains to like making a project or a product, right?
You know, so I feel like in that respect that like I'm only picking people for this that I know, you know, have the time for one, and also for two, I feel like can I really extract meaningful feedback from? So like that's really like the main thing, is to be able to have that connection where I can really grill them for some stuff if I need it. I don't know if I'll need it for this, but perhaps in the future. Anyways, I have a lot of documentation in that regard. When that time does come, I allow people to post videos for this stuff. So if the music doesn't get you copyrighted and destroyed, or you can turn it off, you'll be perfectly allowed to record the demo and post it. There is a lot of disclaimers to go with that, of course, because, you know, this doesn't represent a final product. There's a lot of stuff I want to change. It's ripped assets. It's not going to be public. Don't DMCA whoever releases this.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
So, but on that end, like, I'm fine showing it as it is, because the work life of this is still longer than anything I've ever worked on except for D&D. So there's still like a tremendous, like when I look at people's example content for Unreal Engine, it is really sobering that most people are not as far as I am, who've put way more time into it, who have trained experience and been tutored and mentored and are on people's Patreon getting help from whoever. And I have something that is more polished for sure. Like for what is in there is more polished and more stable than a lot of stuff. And that's honestly terrifying. Because, you know, you know how much of a fucking mess this is. Like I said, I've just been struggling to just get the fucking jump points to work, teleportation. I don't have a damn clue what's going on. Most people haven't even bothered with nav links in their games. So,
listen, I mean,
it's ridiculous.
If somebody who's going through as much nonsense and bullshit in their real life as you are can put together this, like, it really does. I mean, it is terrifying, but you can also see it as empowering, that, like, it doesn't really matter what life throws at you. It doesn't really matter what stupid shit happens or what terrible, like, tragic shit occurs. Like, as long as you still have power, a roof over your head, you got a computer and an internet connection, you can make shit. You can accomplish shit that, like, AAA developers, big money games and etc., they don't even aspire to. They don't even dream about it. It's not that they couldn't. They just choose not to. So, like, knowing that it's a significant part of it is coming from internal motivation and, like, a desire to see that which has not yet been created, I think is it's a nice, powerful, and optimistic even lesson for you in that sense, where it's like, or a mantra to hold on to maybe as you're working on this stuff. So I don't know if that helps you see a brighter silver lining or something, but that's what it speaks to me, is like, I think that's a huge inspirational aspect of that, is that, like, dude, literally anybody can do this. Like, you don't really need, like, you don't need crazy stability even to make something like this, as your real life is demonstrating. Like, you can do some great things with just the desire to see something better, and the willpower to will it into existence, I guess.
This project is devoted to my cats, my 2 cats. So I try to live as they lived, where all the insanity that befell them, they were just cats. They were simple, and it didn't bother them because they were just simple. I try to aspire to that simplicity. Mm-hmm. I try to aspire to that honesty, just that baseness, where just like in October, between my work, I'm in the hospital, I'm surrounded by people dying, yelling for help, beds just piled up in the hallways, not a shred of privacy, half naked 80-year-old people just stuck, full view right out in front of 3 separate elevators, because literally 3.
Yeah, no dignity at all.
Just like the most depressing, horrific scene imaginable is the average Canadian healthcare system. And like, I'm going back and forth, seeing people make no progress, people getting sicker, things getting worse for weeks and weeks and weeks. Got the landlord shit hanging over my head, all this other stuff. So, and then, you come home and you sit down for the day, and it's like, well, my cats didn't give a fuck. So I'm just not going to give a fuck. I'm just going to keep working. So throughout that, I'm getting in, the menus and all this other shit. And then this isn't really flashy. Like, when I work on stuff, I try to say, like, the thing that keeps me going is seeing my stuff in motion. Well, it's just a menu. It's not like big lights. I don't even have custom. I can't even put Comic Sans in yet because I don't know how to. And like, it's just there, but it's there, and you're building in little bits and pieces, and you got to compartmentalize each individual thing. That, yes, I got the menu done. That's something I don't need to worry about. That's one thing off my little list. Having the December demo in my mind is a lot less about just being able to show something off, because I've already showed off a lot. But it's also about keeping honest with my expectations. Where this project, if I'm permitted, could be massive. You could have hundreds of hours of gameplay in this very easily. It all just depends on if I feel like there's interesting content to put in it, interesting in combat and stuff to explore, it'll just keep growing. But you don't think about that when you're at this point. You think about the simple things, like getting that IK to retarget to work with a demon character. That was big for me. This was something I was working a lot right before we switched to Unreal 5, and this is fucking impossible. Now I have something I can use for that. That's big. That's an accomplishment. Now my next goals for him is to make fire particles and stuff like that. And that's when the exciting stuff comes, because this is something I know I can do really well and I have done. Couldn't really do it for the Void Hounds because you were following a specific style. Now we're going to take advantage of all those things that I was gathering in the last couple of years, all the stuff I made for Retribution. We're really going to put that all together and put it on this dude and set up a different kind of enemy that behaves differently and everything else. It's going to open up a whole new window to the way you engage with us as existing stuff. And then you're seeing your stuff come to life. And that is a very obtainable goal. That's very reachable. With my learning disabilities and with the motivation and the depression and everything else and then real life, the hardest part has always been to focus on the now, compartmentalize the now, focus just on the one little thing that you can achieve. I had to live like that day by day against my will, but to be able to willfully enact that is definitely an expression of power. It means that you can finally tune it all out, just focus on the one little thing. So today, probably going to go to sleep soon, but depending on what happens with the landlord, if anything, we're going to get out, just do my errands, and then we're going to try to finish setting up this fucking fallback for the jumping that's not really working for the Void Hound right now. And then we might think about going back to Arbiter, and we just piecemeal stuff, and then we're gonna go and work on those new stuff and work on our other weed or sadistic weed. So we have sadism and masochism.
There you
and
go.
That's what's kept me going. Is when I started this project, it was because of Snowball, and we just take one day at a step at a time. That's how we do it for everything in this. And it is certainly the most difficult thing I've ever worked on. Not just because of the complexity and because I've been terrified of getting into anything programmatic for so long, but because there's so much in it that I don't really know how to do. Like, the subject matter is so massive. Like the IK retargeter alone, there's so much in it that is just totally undocumented. There's nothing. I'm walking in uncharted territory in many ways. And I'm still seeing some progress in that. So it's hard. Like, I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but it's hard to say. It's like, at least I am making progress. To me, life has always been fucking insane. It's always been nuts. It's always been stupid shit going on. I haven't had I had the 2 days to myself in September, but beyond that, or 2 weeks, like semi-insanity. But for the last like over 10 years, it's just been non-stop crazy shit for fucking ever. But even before that, in my golden age of like 2003, 2004, there was so much struggling with the motivational aspect to keep focused on stuff. And then I'd encounter a lot of stability with my projects that always kill motivation, especially like Diablo 2. Was really, really, really difficult to get into because it was so heavily hard-coded. At the time, I didn't have the context I have today to really even get into that. And, you know, the motivation was very hard to deal with projects like that. Nowadays, it's like the means exist to resolve just about everything I've had. Like, I've had some stability issues and a lot of growing pains with Unreal 5.1 and Unreal 5.0 because I'm literally writing cutting-edge technology right now. But I can roll around that and keep working on other stuff, and none of that stuff slows me down at all anymore. So, you know, in order to grow, you have to lose everything. That's what it's taught me.
Dedicated to your cats, obviously started because of them. I think it's fitting we conclude with a quote from HKS himself: "You're a cat."
You're a cat.
And yeah, smoke weed, dude. I look forward to seeing this fucking project in action in December. And maybe before then, we'll actually have another episode.
Yeah, maybe.
All right, man. Until next time.
Smoke weed every day.